The desert was on fire. A military nurse named Emily Voss pressed her back against a burning truck, ears ringing from the explosion that had just swallowed the convoy's lead vehicle whole. 30 feet away, a man was screaming. 50 feet past him, the team's sniper lay crumpled on the sand, unconscious, blood pooling dark beneath his helmet. And somewhere above the canyon wall, up a sheer rock face that no sane person would climb under any circumstances, let alone with bullets chewing up the stone around it, sat a Barrett M82 that nobody on this base believed Emily had any business touching. Commander Dale Rush had said it to her face just that morning. "Stay in your lane, Voss. You're a nurse. Act like one." He was about to find out exactly what lane she was in. If this story already has you locked in, do me a favor. Hit subscribe, drop a like, and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what Emily Voss did on that canyon road, you need to understand everything they put her through first. The base smelled like diesel and hot dust, the way every forward operating position in the Nevada high desert smelled by mid-July, like the sun had been grinding the earth down for weeks, and the earth had finally stopped fighting back. Redstone Operations Base sat 40 miles northeast of Silver Ridge, a town too small for its own gas station, and it existed for exactly one reason: to coordinate tactical training operations across the canyon corridor before units rotated overseas. Emily Voss had been assigned to Redstone for 11 weeks. 11 weeks of proving herself to people who had already made up their minds. She was 29, compact, with the kind of stillness that some people mistook for passiveness, and others, the smarter ones, recognized as controlled. She had dark circles she didn't bother hiding, a name badge that said CPT Voss, E, combat nurse, and a habit of arriving to morning formation 3 minutes early that nobody had ever commented on, probably because it didn't fit the story they'd already decided to tell about her. The story was simple. She was a nurse, valuable in a field hospital, dangerous in an actual fight. The kind of person you wanted behind the wire, not outside it. Sergeant First Class Kevin Teller had been the loudest voice in that particular choir. He was 36, barrel-chested, with 15 years of infantry experience, and the absolute certainty of a man who had never once been surprised by his own limitations. "Voss," he said that morning, finding her at the armory's side door where she was documenting a medication log. He didn't say good morning. He never did. "Heard you put in another request for the long-range qual." "I did," she said, without looking up. "Third time this month." "That's correct." He leaned against the doorframe with the practiced ease of a man who expected space to accommodate him. "Commander's gonna say no again. Then he'll say no again." Teller made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "You know what your problem is? You can't read a room. Nurses don't shoot. That's not a knock. It's just how it works. We've got designated guys for that, trained guys." Emily finished the log entry, capped her pen, and looked at him for the first time. "Are you done?" He blinked. "I'm trying to help you." "You're not," she said, "but thank you." She walked past him, and he let her go, which was its own kind of statement. Commander Dale Rush ran the tightest operational unit Emily had ever served under, which she genuinely respected, and he had a blind spot about 6 feet wide and shaped like a woman in a medical crosspatch, which she genuinely did not. He was 51, former Ranger, all bone and conviction, and he believed, in the marrow of his bones evidently, that a unit worked best when everyone stayed exactly where they had been put. The meeting that morning lasted 4 minutes. "Request denied," Rush said, not looking up from the topographic map spread across his desk. "Sir, with respect, Voss, I've read your file. Your nursing quals are exceptional. Your triage scores are some of the best we've seen at this base. You're an asset." He did look up then, and his expression was not unkind exactly. "Just finished. But we don't have a position for a combat nurse in a sniper qualification program. We have a position for a combat nurse in a medical support role. That's what you signed on for. That's what you do. My father was—" "I know who your father was." He held her gaze. "Major Thomas Voss. Special Forces. Distinguished Service Medal. KIA, Afghanistan, 2009. I'm sorry for your loss. That was a genuine loss for this army." A pause. "But it doesn't change your role here." Emily kept her breathing even. "Understood, sir." Dismissed. She turned, walked to the door, stopped with her hand on the frame. Not for drama, she wasn't built for that, but because something in the flat wall of his certainty had snagged something in her chest and she needed 1 second to decide whether to leave it or pull it loose. She left it. The door clicked shut behind her. The convoy mission briefing happened at 1400 hours. 12 vehicles, 2 MATVs on point, the rest a mix of cargo and personnel transports moving through Canyon Route 7, a stretch of high desert road that cut between 2 ridge systems and came out near a fuel depot 40 miles north. Standard logistics run. The kind of thing units did 3 times a week, the kind of thing that felt routine until it wasn't. Emily was assigned to Vehicle 4, the designated medical support transport, along with a 19-year-old medic named Private First Class Danny Oakes, who had been at Redstone for exactly 3 weeks and had the eyes of someone still deciding whether to be scared or excited at any given moment. "You think anything's going to happen?" Danny asked as they loaded equipment into the back of the transport. "Statistically," Emily said, "no. But statistically is just probability. It doesn't promise you anything." She checked the seal on a trauma bag. "Check your tourniquet pouches, both sides." He checked them. "Do you get nervous? On these?" She thought about it honestly. "I used to," she said. "I don't anymore. I just get ready." He seemed to want more than that, so she gave it to him. "Nervous doesn't help anyone. Ready does. Focus on what you can control. Everything else you deal with when it shows up." He nodded, processing this with the solemnity of someone storing it somewhere important. The convoy rolled out at 14:30. No. Canyon Route 7 was beautiful in the way that indifferent things sometimes are. Red stone walls rising 60, 70 feet on either side. The kind of formations that had been there for millions of years and would be there for millions more regardless of what any human beings did at the bottom of them. The afternoon light hit the upper ridge lines and turned them copper, and if you were someone inclined toward that kind of observation, you might have noticed it. Emily noticed it. She also noticed the absence of any bird movement along the eastern ridge for the last mile and a half. She noticed that the rocks on the upper western shelf had a pattern of discoloration that didn't match the surrounding stone. She noticed these things the way her father had taught her to notice them. Quietly, without announcement, the way you file information you hope you won't need. She said nothing. What would she say? "Commander, I noticed the birds have gone quiet. Teller would have a field day. Rush would remind her of her lane." Vehicle 4 rolled on. Boom. The explosion hit Vehicle 1 at 15:47. Emily felt it before she heard it, a pressure change, a wrongness in the air, and then the sound arrived like a physical thing, and the transport shuddered, and Danny grabbed the seat in front of him and said something that got swallowed by the noise. "Contact!" someone was shouting over the radio. "Lead vehicle down! We have contact, multiple positions, East Ridge. All vehicles halt." That was Rush, his voice sharp and controlled, already in command mode. "Establish cover. Designated shooters, identify positions." Emily was already moving. She had the trauma bag off the hook before the transport fully stopped, had the door open before the driver told her to wait, was out and low and running before anyone in the vehicle understood what was happening. The canyon had become a different place in the space of 30 seconds. Black smoke from the lead vehicle was climbing the rock wall on the east side. Small arms fire was coming from at least 3 elevated positions. She clocked them fast, high left, high right, a third behind a natural rock shelf about 40 feet up the western wall. Soldiers were out of vehicles and using them for cover, returning fire in short controlled bursts, but they were pinned. The angle was wrong, the positions too high, and whoever had set this up had set it up well. She reached the lead vehicle in 14 seconds. The driver was dead. She knew it at a glance and didn't stop. The passenger, a specialist named Okafor, was alive with a fragment wound to the shoulder and a dazed expression that suggested mild concussion. She got a pressure bandage on the shoulder wound in under 45 seconds, told him not to move, and was already moving again toward the second casualty she'd spotted, a staff sergeant who had been thrown clear of the blast and was sitting against the canyon wall holding his leg with both hands. "Talk to me," she said, dropping beside him. "I'm fine," he said. He was not fine. His left leg below the knee was wrong in a way legs were not supposed to be wrong. "You're not fine, but you're going to be." She got the tourniquet on. "What's your name?" "Briggs." Okay, Briggs, stay flat. Don't try to move. She looked up at the ridge. Can you tell me where the sniper was positioned? Briggs blinked at her. What? Corporal Marsh, where was he when the... He went down. Briggs pointed toward the eastern rock face. Caught something in the head. I saw him go down hard over by the... He stopped, squinted through the smoke. I don't know. Up there somewhere. He was trying to get elevation. Emily followed his gesture. The eastern wall had a shelf about 35 feet up, accessible by a rough scramble of natural footholds that she wouldn't call a path exactly, but that a person in decent shape could navigate under ordinary circumstances. Under these circumstances, with fire coming from multiple directions, it was something else entirely. On that shelf, barely visible through the smoke and the chaos, she could see the Barrett, the team's long-range precision rifle, and the motionless shape of Corporal James Marsh beside it. Her stomach went cold, not with fear, with calculation. Voss! Commander Rush's voice cut through the noise. He was 20 feet back, crouched behind the second vehicle, coordinating fire with hand signals to the right flank. Get behind cover, now! I have 2 casualties stabilized, she called back, moving toward him in a low run. Okafor and Briggs, Okafor can function. Briggs needs evac, but he's tourniqueted and stable. Good. Stay low and... Marsh is down, she said. He's on the east shelf. He's not moving. Rush's jaw tightened. I know. The Barrett's up there with him. I know that too, Voss. Who's your next designated shooter? Something moved across his face. We're working the problem. Sir. She kept her voice flat, factual, without urgency she didn't feel, and with the urgency she did. They have RPG capability on the upper western shelf. I counted 2 operators. If they get a clear angle on the vehicle cluster, we're going to lose people. I can see the ridge, Captain. Then you know we need that rifle working. A beat. The canyon walls threw the sounds of gunfire back at them in overlapping echoes. Corporal Liu is moving to retrieve the weapon, Rush said. Emily looked across the killing ground toward the east wall. Liu was a good soldier. She knew him, liked him. He was also 5'9", 220 pounds of muscle, and the scramble to that shelf was going to take him 4 minutes minimum under these conditions. They didn't have 4 minutes. She could see the RPG operator on the western shelf settling into position, setting up, taking his time, because he had all of it in the world right now. Sir, she said, let me go. Rush stared at her. Flat, certain, done. Absolutely not. I can reach that shelf in 90 seconds, maybe less. You're a nurse. I'm a... She stopped, exhaled, started again. Sir, I have the physical profile for that climb. I know the approach, and I know how to use that weapon. You don't have the training. I do. She held his gaze. I have the training. I just don't have the paperwork. He looked at her for a long second. The RPG operator was still settling. Liu was still making his way around the burning lead vehicle, trying to find a covered approach. Stay behind cover, Rush said. That is a direct order. He turned back to his radio. Emily turned back to the casualties. She checked Okafor again. Stable, coherent, functional. She checked Briggs, tourniquet holding, pain getting to him, but he was tough. And she'd take tough. She checked the 2 additional wounded that had been brought to her position since she'd stabilized the first 2. One with a minor fragment wound to the forearm, one with what felt like a cracked rib from being thrown against the doorframe. All of them were alive. All of them were going to stay alive if the RPG operator on that western shelf didn't get his angle. She looked at the western ridge. The operator had his angle. She looked at Liu, still 40 feet from the base of the eastern wall, pinned behind a truck by the volume of fire from the high left position. She looked at the shelf, at the still shape of James Marsh, at the Barrett lying beside him in the dust. She thought about her father. Not the way people think about the dead. Not with grief or longing or any of that, not right now. She thought about him the way you think about a teacher when you're sitting in front of a problem they spent years preparing you for. You hesitate because you're afraid of being wrong, he'd told her once. But sometimes the only thing you're wrong about is waiting. She picked up her trauma bag, because old habits, and she ran. Not toward the vehicles, not toward cover, toward the eastern wall. The first 15 feet were the worst. She was fully exposed, crossing a stretch of open ground between the vehicle cluster and the base of the canyon wall, with fire coming from two directions, and nothing between her and it except speed and the fact that people under stress don't shoot straight. She felt rounds hit the dirt to her left, heard the crack of something too close overhead, and she kept running because running was the only option that made any sense. She hit the wall and pressed into it, breathing hard, giving herself 2 seconds. Above her, the shelf, 35 feet up. Marsh, still motionless. The Barrett, still there. Below her on the canyon floor, the sound of Rush's voice on the radio, sharp and controlled, and then louder, closer. "Voss, stand down! That is an order!" She started climbing. The footholds were irregular, some solid, some crumbling, and she tested each one before committing her weight with a speed that was just below reckless and just above suicidal, which was the only speed available. A burst of automatic fire chewed up the stone 6 inches from her right hand, and she flattened against the rock and waited for it to stop, and then kept moving because the alternative was to stop moving, and that wasn't an alternative. 20 feet up, 25. Her right boot slipped on a crumbling ledge, and she caught herself with her left hand, and the wall tore the skin off her palm, and she kept climbing. 30 feet. Almost there. She pulled herself over the lip of the shelf and rolled behind the natural berm of rock that Marsh had been using for cover, and lay flat for a moment just breathing while rounds sparked off the stone above her head. Then she looked at Marsh. He was alive, barely. There was blood on the right side of his helmet where something, fragment probably, had caught him hard enough to put him down. His breathing was shallow and fast, the kind of breathing that told her he was in more trouble than it looked. And when she checked his pupils, they were uneven. Possible TBI. Possible intracranial bleed. She needed him to stay still, and she needed him to not die in the next 15 minutes, and she needed to deal with one thing at a time. She pulled the Barrett toward her. It was a .50 caliber, 5 feet of precision machinery, 25 pounds when loaded, and she had not touched one in 4 years. She checked the chamber. 1 round seated, magazine full, optic intact, bipod functional. Everything her father had ever told her came back in a rush that didn't feel like memory so much as muscle. Breathing first, then position, then everything else. She got behind the rifle. Okay. Down on the canyon floor, the situation had deteriorated in the 60 seconds she'd been climbing. She could see it from here, the wider picture that you couldn't get from ground level. The RPG operator on the western shelf had shifted his position and was now aimed at the vehicle cluster from an angle that Lou couldn't cover and Rush couldn't address without exposing his flank. 2 of the eastern positions were walking their fire toward the wounded staging area, and a 4th position had appeared on the northern ridgeline, a late arrival, trying to cut off the exit route. She had maybe 45 seconds before any one of 3 bad things happened simultaneously. She put her eye to the scope. The world shrank to a circle. Her father had always said that the hardest part wasn't the shot. The hardest part was the breath before it. The moment when the noise of everything else had to become background, when the only thing that existed was the circle and the target at the center of it and the slow exhale that would decide the outcome. She found the RPG operator. He was 280 meters out, elevated, partially covered by a rock outcropping. Through the scope, she could see him as clearly as if she were standing beside him. The way he was positioned, the way he'd braced the launcher, the way he was taking his time. He had no idea she was up here. She exhaled. Slow. Her father's voice, somewhere behind the noise of the battle, behind the ringing in her ears and the sound of rounds striking stone. Don't chase the shot. Let it come to you. The crosshair settled. She squeezed. The Barrett fired and the recoil rolled through her shoulder, and the RPG operator dropped, and the launcher tumbled off the western shelf. And 280 meters away, there was suddenly one less reason for 17 people to die. Below her on the canyon floor, she heard someone shout. Not in fear, but in stunned, disoriented confusion. Who's shooting? Who the hell is... It came from the east shelf. Is that Marsh? Is Marsh up? She was already cycling to the second target. The eastern high left position, 210 meters. Steep angle. The shooter was behind solid cover, but he'd shifted to look toward the western shelf where the RPG operator had just gone down, which meant for approximately 2 seconds he was exposed on his left side. She found him in the scope. She fired. The position went quiet, She was already moving to the third, the northern ridgeline, the late arrival who was trying to cut off the exit. 340 meters. The longest shot she'd attempted in 4 years, on a rifle she hadn't fired in that same time, from a position that was actively taking fire from the second eastern elevation. She heard the stone crack behind her head, and pressed lower and found the target, and for a moment, one long, stretched-out moment, she could see him as clearly as if he were right in front of her. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle fired. She waited. The northern position went still. Below her, the canyon had changed again. The volume of fire had dropped. Dramatically, suddenly, like someone turning down a dial. 2 of the 4 positions were down. The northern exit was clear. The remaining eastern shooter had gone to ground, and she could hear Rush's voice, still controlled, still sharp, calling the unit to press the advantage while they had it. She let out a breath she'd been holding for approximately the last 4 years. Then Corporal James Marsh, lying 3 feet from her on the shelf, made a sound. It wasn't language exactly. It was the sound a person makes when their body is trying to come back from somewhere it maybe shouldn't come back from, and Emily was beside him in a second, one hand on his wrist, reading his pulse with a speed and accuracy that had nothing to do with sniper training and everything to do with 11 years of learning what it means when a person's body starts to lose the argument. His pulse was there, weak and wrong, and there. "Marsh," she said, keeping her voice even. "Can you hear me?" Nothing. "Marsh, yeah." She checked his airway, confirmed it was clear, checked his pupils again. The asymmetry had worsened. Whatever was happening inside his skull, it was progressing. She looked at the canyon below. The firefight was still active. The remaining eastern position was still putting rounds out, and Rush's unit was maneuvering but not there yet. Lou was visible at the base of the eastern wall, looking up at her with an expression she couldn't fully read from here, but that she suspected contained several competing emotions. She looked at the Barrett. She looked at Marsh. She looked at the canyon floor, where the last enemy position was still preventing Rush's unit from reaching the northern exit, from getting the convoy moving, from getting these people out. 17 service members on the canyon floor. 1 man on the shelf beside her who was losing ground inside his own skull. She had maybe 60 seconds to decide what she was going to do, and she already knew the answer, had probably known it before she finished the 3rd shot, before she even confirmed the 3rd target was down, because there was no version of this where the calculation came out any other way. She set the Barrett down. She reached for her trauma bag, and Corporal James Marsh's pulse, already weak, already wrong, flickered once and stopped. She didn't think. Thinking was for people who had time. Emily dropped the Barrett, pulled off her gloves, pressed 2 fingers to Marsh's neck and confirmed what she already knew. No pulse, not even a flicker, just the awful stillness of a body that had decided it was done. She got her hands positioned on his chest before the thought had fully formed, before she had consciously chosen to do this instead of the other thing, instead of picking up the rifle and finishing what she'd started. The choice had already been made. She just had to live inside it now. She started compressions. 30 to 2. 30 to 2. The rhythm her instructors had drilled into her years before she ever set foot on a base, before she learned anything about rifles or canyon trajectories or the terrible geometry of ambush warfare. She counted in her head because counting kept the mind from going to the places it wanted to go, from thinking about the 4th enemy position, still active on the eastern wall below, from thinking about 17 people on that canyon floor who needed this to resolve itself in the next few minutes, or the math was going to stop working in their favor. Dust settled on her hands. She kept going. "Marsh." She wasn't talking to him, not exactly. People in cardiac arrest don't answer, and she knew that. But silence felt wrong. "You are not dying on this shelf. I need you to be clear on that." The canyon below was still a firefight. She could hear it without looking, the controlled bursts of return fire from Rush's unit, the sporadic answering fire from the remaining eastern position, the occasional radio traffic that reached her in fragments. "East position still active, we cannot move the convoy." "Marsh." Is Marsh responsive? Does anyone have eyes on? "Someone is shooting from the shelf. I repeat, shots are coming from the east shelf." She'd stopped shooting. She'd been shooting and then she'd stopped, and now they knew she was up here. But they didn't know why she'd stopped. And the 4th position was still active, and she was counting compressions on a man who wasn't breathing while 17 other people tried to stay alive below her. 26, 27, 28. She checked his airway, gave 2 rescue breaths, went back to compressions. On the canyon floor, she heard something change in the pattern of gunfire. A gap. A pause. The kind of pause that meant somebody was repositioning or reloading or both. And in that pause, she heard Rush's voice, closer now, elevated. He'd moved to a better position, calling fire commands with the precision of someone who had spent 30 years learning exactly how to be calm while everything around him refused to cooperate. She kept compressing. 40 seconds in, 50. A round hit the rock face 2 feet to her left and showered her with stone fragments, and she didn't stop. Flinched, yes, because she wasn't made of anything other than the usual materials, but didn't stop, kept the rhythm, 30 to 2, 30 to 2, because stopping was the one option that wasn't available to her. 60 seconds. And then it was subtle, the way these things always are, the way they teach you in training, but you never quite believe until you feel it under your own hands. A small, irregular tremor in his chest that wasn't her doing it, a little muscular protest from somewhere deep in the machinery of him. She stopped compressions, pressed her fingers to his neck. Pulse. Not strong, not regular. But present, actually present, not her hoping it was there, a thin, stubborn thread of heartbeat that said not yet to the darkness that had been moving in. "There you are," she said, and she meant it. She checked his airway again, repositioned his head, confirmed he was breathing on his own, shallow but real, and then she looked at the Barrett lying in the dust 3 feet away. One active position remaining. Eastern wall, high. The position that had been walking fire toward the wounded staging area before she'd taken out the other 3. The position that was currently keeping Rush's unit from breaking the ambush's final hold on the canyon exit. She looked at Marsh. Stable, for now. Unconscious, which was actually better than conscious given what was likely happening in his skull. She needed a medic up here within 20 minutes or the TBI was going to become a different conversation. But that was 20 minutes away and this was right now. She picked up the Barrett. Getting back behind the rifle was different this time. The first 3 shots had been made with the clarity of someone operating on pure urgency, no hesitation, the problem presenting itself and the solution following. This was different. This was her hand shaking, not badly, not enough to matter mechanically, but she felt it, the way the body processes what it's been through when the initial surge ebbs slightly and the accounting begins. She breathed it out. She'd been trained by someone who never flinched, who moved through high-stress situations with an economy that seemed almost inhuman until you understood it wasn't the absence of feeling, but the discipline of postponement. "You feel it later," her father had said. "Right now, you just act." She found the eastern position in the scope, 260 meters, partly obscured by a natural rock shelf that hadn't been there, in terms of her sight lines, from any of the other positions she'd engaged. The shooter had good instincts. He'd tucked himself behind the most coverage available and he was methodical, firing in short, controlled bursts, shifting slightly between shots. Smart, disciplined. Whoever these people were, they weren't improvising. She tracked him for 15 seconds, reading the pattern of his movement, the small shifts he made between fire sequences, the rhythm of it. Then she waited for the next shift. He moved. She fired. The eastern position stopped. Below her, for a few seconds, the canyon was almost quiet. The kind of quiet that sounds enormous after sustained gunfire. Not peaceful, because nothing about this was peaceful, but huge. The smoke was still rising from the lead vehicle. The canyon walls were still close, but the shooting had stopped, and in the space where it had been, she could hear voices, urgent, disoriented, recalibrating. "Contact broken. I say again, contact broken. All positions report. East position is down, west shelf is clear, north exit is clear. I'm not getting any more." "Who cleared those positions? What team is on the east shelf?" A pause. "Sir, I think it was..." She didn't hear the rest. She was already back beside Marsh, checking his pulse, checking his airway, reassessing, doing the things that came before anything else. His pulse was still there. Irregular, but there. "Okay," she told him and herself. "Okay." The first soldier up the rock face was Liu. He made the climb in under 3 minutes, which was faster than she'd expected. And when he came over the lip of the shelf and saw her crouched over Marsh With the Barrett lying in the dust beside her, the expression on his face went through about 6 different iterations in the space of 2 seconds. "Is he alive?" she said. "Pulses present. Suspected TBI, possible intracranial bleed. He went into cardiac arrest approximately 5 minutes ago, and I got him back, but he needs more than I can do up here. I need a stretcher, and I need a medic, and I need them in the next 15 minutes. Lou stared at her, then at the Barrett, then at the positions on the canyon walls, the now silent positions, and something in his expression shifted into something she couldn't name precisely. "You shot them," he said. "All of them. Get the stretcher." "Captain Voss." "Liu?" She looked at him directly. "Marsh needs to be off this shelf. Everything else waits." He moved. Deshet. Getting Marsh down the rock face took 7 minutes, 3 soldiers, and a field-improvised harness made from equipment straps that Emily engineered without being asked, while the soldiers worked out between themselves how to tell Commander Rush what they'd found on the shelf. She heard Rush's voice before she saw him, cutting through the noise of the post-contact assessment, reorganizing the convoy, coordinating the casualty count. By the time she came down off the wall with the last of the medical equipment, the canyon floor had transformed from a battlefield into something that resembled a disaster response zone. Vehicles being repositioned, wounded being triaged, a perimeter being established with the tight efficiency of a unit that had drilled for exactly this. Rush was standing at the base of the eastern wall when she reached the bottom. He looked at her for a long moment. The blood on her palm where she'd caught herself during the climb, the dust on her uniform, the Barrett, which Lou was carrying down in a separate rig. "Tell me," he said. His voice was not what she expected. It wasn't anger, or rather, anger was in there, but it was competing with other things. And whatever those other things were, they were making the whole register complicated in a way that surprised her. 4 positions, she said. Western shelf, 2 eastern elevations, northern ridgeline, all neutralized. Ranges from 210 to 340 meters. Corporal Marsh went into cardiac arrest while I was engaged with the final target. I performed CPR and restored pulse. He needs immediate medevac, suspected TBI with possible intracranial bleed. Stop. Rush held up a hand. She stopped. He looked at her for another long moment. Behind him, soldiers were moving, talking, doing the dozens of tasks that followed a contact event, and all of it felt very far away. "You disobeyed a direct order," he said. "Yes, sir." "I told you to stay behind cover." "You did." "You took a weapon you are not authorized to operate." "I understand that's what the paperwork says." Something shifted in his face. "The paperwork? Sir, I'd like to request that Marsh's medevac be called in first. The rest of this conversation can—" "It's been called in," he said, 2 minutes ago. A pause. "Liu told me." She nodded. "He also told me about the cardiac arrest," Rush said. "And what you did." Another pause, longer. "And the shots." She waited. 340 meters, he said. It wasn't a question, exactly. "Yes, sir." "On a rifle you haven't qualified with." "I've qualified with that platform before. Not through channels you have access to." He looked at her steadily. "Explain that." She thought about how much to give him, and then decided the moment for managing information had probably passed. "My father didn't just take me to the range," she said. "He trained me. Formally. Starting when I was 14. Precision marksmanship, long-range platforms, ballistics, environmental compensation. He trained me the same way he was trained. When he died, I went into nursing because—" She stopped, started again. "Because I didn't want to carry a gun for a living anymore. But the training didn't go anywhere." Rush was silent. "I put in for the long-range qual 3 times, she said. "I know you denied it. I understand why, given what you had in my file. But the capability exists whether or not it's documented." "Why didn't you tell me?" He said it quietly, which was somehow more unsettling than volume would have been. "Would you have believed me?" He didn't answer immediately. "Tell her," she said, without inflection. "The briefings. The way this unit talks about what a combat nurse is supposed to be. Sir, I spent 11 weeks here making the case through legitimate channels. I filed requests. I showed up early to formation. I did the work." A pause. Nobody here was looking for reasons to change their mind. Another long silence. Around them, the convoy was reorganizing. The medevac was 3 minutes out, and 17 people were alive who very possibly would not have been if the morning had gone differently. "You should have told me," Rush said finally. "Whatever my response would have been, you should have told me." "You're right," she said. "And you should have looked at me as something other than a nurse with Elaine." She said it without heat, just fact. He took that in. She watched him take it in, not easily, not without resistance, but honestly, which was more than she'd expected. "We'll debrief at base," he said. "Full account, all of it." A pause. "There will be an inquiry." "I know. It won't be simple." "I know that too." He looked at her for one more moment, and she couldn't read everything in his expression. It was too complicated, too many competing things at once. But somewhere in it, underneath the operational commander's assessment of a situation that had just become significantly more complex, she thought she saw something that might have been the early edge of respect. Might have been. She wasn't going to count it. "Dismissed, Captain," he said. "Go check on your casualties." She went. The medevac arrived in a cloud of rotor wash and canyon dust, and Emily stood back while the flight medics took over Marsh's care, gave them the full handoff, vitals, timeline, the cardiac arrest, the CPR, the return of pulse, her assessment of the TBI, in the clipped, efficient shorthand of someone who knew exactly what the next team needed to hear. The flight medic, a woman about Emily's age with the no-nonsense focus of someone who'd done this 100 times, looked up during the handoff with an expression that said she was already calculating. "You performed CPR under fire?" "While managing a fourth target engagement," Emily said. "Sequential, not simultaneous. I had to make a call." The flight medic held her gaze for a second. Then she went back to Marsh. Okafor was loaded second. The shoulder fragment wound was clean, the concussion assessment stable, but he needed imaging that the canyon couldn't provide. Briggs, leg immobilized in tourniquet holding, went third. The medic with the cracked rib was assessed and cleared for ground transport. Emily's palm, which she hadn't thought about since she'd finished climbing, turned out to be more than superficially torn. The flight medic taped it wordlessly while Emily's attention was elsewhere, and she didn't notice until she looked down and found it wrapped. "Thanks," Emily said. "Buy me a coffee," the flight medic said, and went back to her patients. The helicopter lifted. Emily watched it clear the canyon walls and bank north, getting smaller against the wide desert sky, and she stood there for a moment with the sound of it fading and the dust settling back around her feet, and the weight of the last, she checked, 43 minutes pressing down on her all at once. Her hands were shaking now, more than before. That was normal. That was the body settling accounts. She made fists, held them, opened them. Okay. The convoy reached the fuel depot at 1821, 94 minutes later than scheduled. Nobody said much during the drive. The lead vehicle had been too damaged to move. It was left in the canyon with a recovery team flagged for later retrieval. They drove in a tighter formation, spacing adjusted, a soldier in the turret of every available vehicle scanning the ridgelines that were now just empty rock in the long desert afternoon light. Emily sat in Vehicle 4 with Danny Oakes, who had performed well during the contact, had triaged the rib fracture under fire, had helped stabilize Briggs while Emily was on the cliff, had kept his head in the first minutes when keeping your head was harder than anything else. He sat across from her now with his hands between his knees and his eyes on the floor of the transport, and she could see him replaying it, the way you always do, the way you can't stop yourself from doing. "You did good," she said. He looked up. "Out there. You did good. The Briggs tourniquet, that was your call. Your execution, that counted." He was quiet for a moment. "I saw you climb the wall," he said. I didn't know you could." "Nobody knew," she said. "That was sort of the point." He thought about this. "Were you scared?" She considered lying. The comfortable version, where she said something confident and instructive that he'd remember later as wisdom. Then she thought about all the years of people telling convenient stories about who she was and what she could do. "Yes," she said. "I was scared the whole time. Being scared just wasn't the most important thing happening. He sat with that. Outside the window, the desert rolled past in the late afternoon gold, bare and enormous and completely indifferent to everything that had just happened in it. "What happens now?" he asked. "To you, I mean." "Debrief," she said. "Inquiry, probably." "Because you disobeyed the order." "That's correct." He frowned. "Even though—" "Yeah," she said. "Even though—" The debrief began at 20:30 hours in the base command room, and it lasted 3 hours. Rush ran it personally. He had a notebook and a recorder and the contained expression of a man who was trying very hard to be two things at once: the commander who needed to account for a serious breach of protocol and the soldier who had watched the breach of protocol save 17 lives. Emily could see the tension of it in the set of his shoulders, the way he phrased questions, the pauses between answers where he processed not just what she was saying, but what it meant. Teller was present. He sat at the far end of the table and said nothing for the first hour, which Emily suspected cost him more effort than anything else he'd done that day. She gave the full account, not in the detached tactical shorthand of an after-action report. She'd do that on paper, but in real sequence. What she'd seen on the drive out, the bird movement, the stone discoloration, why she hadn't said anything, the explosion, the casualty assessment, the decision at the eastern wall, the climb. When she got to the part about Marsh's cardiac arrest, Teller made a sound, not a word, just a sound, and Rush looked at him once and he stopped. "You left an active engagement," Rush said. "Confirm target still unengaged to perform CPR." "Yes, sir." "Why?" She looked at him. "Because he was dying. You had 4 hostile positions, 3 down, 1 still active, and a man in cardiac arrest 18 inches from my hands." She kept her voice level. "You're asking me to explain a triage decision, sir. I made a triage decision. By abandoning the rifle. By saving a life. The remaining target could have—" "And then I went back to the rifle," she said. "He was stable. I went back." A pause. "I know how this looks on paper, but all 4 positions are down and Corporal Marsh is on a medevac and the convoy made it to the depot. The outcomes are what they are." The room was quiet. Rush wrote something in his notebook. "The shot metrics," he said, and his voice had changed. Still careful, still professional, but with something underneath it that she hadn't heard from him before. 340 meters on the northern position." "Yes, sir." "Conditions?" "Active incoming fire. Smoke interference from the lead vehicle, partial. Wind from the northwest at approximately 12 miles per hour. Elevated position, downward angle, approximately 35 feet. He wrote more. "And the Marsh arrest?" He paused, seemed to recalibrate. "How long was CPR administered before return of pulse?" "Approximately 60 seconds of compressions before the initial check. Pulse confirmed on first check post-compressions. Rhythm was irregular but sustained." Rush set down his pen, looked at her. "You have to understand," he said slowly, "that none of this—" He stopped, started again. "The training background, Major Voss, the qualification history. None of this appears in your file, Captain." "I know." "Medically, yes. Tactically, I have a combat nurse with exceptional nursing credentials and nothing else. I understand what my file says. So how am I supposed to—" He cut himself off again. Rush was not a man who left sentences unfinished, and the fact that he did it twice in a row told her more than whatever he would have said to complete them. "There will be a formal inquiry," he said. "That's not a threat. That's procedure. Unauthorized use of restricted equipment, disobeying a direct order in a combat situation. These are serious. I know they're serious. I can't just— The outcomes don't erase the protocol violations. You understand that?" "Yes, sir." Teller shifted in his chair. Emily didn't look at him. Rush picked up his pen again. "Is there anything else you want to add to the record before we close this portion of the debrief?" She thought about it. 17 people came home, she said. "I'd like that in the record." He wrote it down. She didn't sleep much. The base returned to its ordinary nighttime rhythms around her, the sounds of a forward operating position after a hard day, the low conversations, the equipment checks, the hum of generators that never entirely stopped. Emily lay in her bunk with her bandaged hand on her chest, and the ceiling above her, and the day replaying in the involuntary, non-linear way that a hard day always replays when you finally stop moving. Not in sequence, in fragments. The birds gone quiet on the eastern ridge, Marsh's uneven pupils. The moment she'd heard his pulse stop. 340 meters, and the crosshair settling, and the breath she'd let out before the trigger. Her father used to say that the distance between who you are and who people think you are is just time. Eventually it closes. You just have to survive long enough. She hadn't thought about that in years. She thought about it now. At 200, she gave up on sleep and went to the medical bay to check on the 2 soldiers still on base. Everyone else had been transported or cleared. She restocked 2 trauma kits that had been depleted during the contact, updated the medication log she'd been writing when Teller had found her that morning. 24 hours ago. Less, technically. She was finishing the log when she heard boots in the corridor. Teller appeared in the doorway. He looked different at 0200, not softer exactly, but stripped of some of the ambient authority that daylight and formation and the architecture of the base lent him. He was just a man in the doorway, looking at her, with something in his expression that she'd never seen on him before because she'd never had occasion to see it. Discomfort. The particular discomfort of a person who has been wrong in a public and significant way. "You should be sleeping," she said. She didn't say it unkindly. "Yeah." He didn't move. "You should be too." "I couldn't. Me neither." He leaned against the door frame, different posture than this morning, when he'd done it with ownership. This was something else. "Briggs is going to be okay. I heard from the surgical team." "Good. I expected as much. The tourniquet timing was solid." "Yeah." A pause. "Listen." She looked at him. "I'm not—" He rubbed the back of his neck. "I don't know how to do this exactly. I'm not built for it, so I'm just going to say it." He met her eyes. "I was wrong about you. I made assumptions about your capabilities that they were based on nothing, just—" He gestured, a vague motion that encompassed something she thought might be rank or habit, or maybe just how I've always thought about people like you. "I was wrong." Emily looked at him for a moment. She could say, "I know." She could say it's fine, which it wasn't. She could say a dozen things that would make this easier for him. "Thank you," she said. Just that. He nodded once, seemed relieved that she hadn't done anything complicated with it. "The inquiry," he said. "Rush is going to run it straight. He's not looking to burn you, but it has to happen." "I know." "After that," he stopped. "I don't know what happens after that, but I wanted you to know. For whatever it's worth." "It's worth something," she said. He left. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the medical bay, with the medication log in front of her and the bandage on her hand and the weight of everything settling into whatever shape it was going to take. Then she picked up her pen and finished the log. The inquiry notification arrived at 800 the following morning. It came in the form of a memo from the base's legal office, addressed to Captain Emily Voss, outlining the scope and timeline of the formal investigation into the events of the previous afternoon. 2 investigating officers from the JAG Corps would arrive at Redstone within 72 hours. Emily was directed to prepare a written account of her actions from 1430 hours to 1821 hours on the date in question, to submit to a formal interview, and to provide documentation of any prior training or qualifications relevant to the events under review. She read it twice, folded it, set it on her desk. Through the window of her quarters, she could see the motor pool, where mechanics were beginning the work of assessing the vehicles that had come back from the canyon. Further out, the desert stretched toward the ridgelines, the same ridgelines she'd watched from the convoy as the birds went quiet, and beyond them the sky was the same hard blue. It always was at this hour. The inquiry was procedure. She understood procedure. What she didn't know yet, what nobody knew, and what was going to determine the shape of the next several months of her life, was whether the people running the procedure were going to look at the evidence of what had happened in that canyon and see a soldier who had saved 17 lives, or a nurse who had overstepped in a way that required a clear and public accounting. She had given Rush the full account. She had told him the truth. The outcomes spoke for themselves, but outcomes didn't always determine verdicts. She was aware of this. She was also aware, and this was the part she hadn't let herself think about too directly, because thinking about it directly made it feel more fragile, that somewhere in the military's records, in files she hadn't seen and couldn't access, there might be documentation of her father's training program that nobody at Redstone had ever thought to look for. Documentation that would corroborate everything she'd said in that debrief room. Documentation that would close the gap between who she was and who they thought she was. Or there might not be. She didn't know. At 08:30, a knock at her door. She opened it to find Danny Oakes standing in the corridor with 2 cups of terrible base coffee and the expression of someone who had thought about this gesture for a while before executing it. Thought you might. He offered one of the cups. I mean, I know it's bad, but she took it. Thank you, Private. He seemed like he wanted to say something else. She let him work up to it. I talked to some of the guys last night, he said. From the convoy. There's a lot of people are saying things. He paused. Good things. About what you did. That's kind of them. It's not kindness, it's just... He looked for the word. True. It's just true. He shifted his weight. Are you going to be okay? With the inquiry and everything? She considered giving him the comfortable answer. I don't know yet, she said. But I'll deal with it. He nodded. He was about to leave when his radio crackled, and the voice that came out of it made Emily go still before she fully understood why. All personnel be advised, incoming transmission from Central Command, priority level Alpha, Alpha priority. She hadn't heard that designation used at Redstone once in 11 weeks. It meant someone above the base level of authority had decided this situation required their attention. It meant someone had already read the preliminary report. It meant the shape of the next several months had just changed, in ways she couldn't see yet, and might not be able to predict. She looked at the cup of terrible coffee in her bandaged hand. She looked at Danny Oakes, whose face had gone from concern to alert, in the time it took the radio to say 4 words. And down the corridor, she heard Commander Rush's voice, controlled, as always, but carrying a note she'd never heard in it before. Get me Captain Voss, he said. Right now. She was moving before Danny had time to react to the radio. The coffee stayed in her hand for about 4 seconds before she found a flat surface to set it on, and then she was in the corridor, walking fast toward the command room. And the base had already changed its texture in the way it did when something from above the normal chain of command reached down into the ordinary operations of a place. People moved differently. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The quality of attention shifted. Alpha priority from Central Command didn't happen because someone had filed a routine debrief report. She pushed open the command room door. Rush was at the far end of the table with a phone to his ear and 2 of his senior NCOs standing behind him in the way people stand when they've been pulled into a room without full context and are trying to read the walls for information. He saw her come in, held up one finger, wait, and kept listening. She waited. The NCOs looked at her the way people had been looking at her since yesterday afternoon, not quite the way they'd looked at her before, but not yet settled into something new either. Somewhere in between. The recalibration was happening in real time, and she could see it on every face she passed. Rush set the phone down. He looked at her for a moment, then at the NCOs. Give us the room, he said. They left without questions. Rush gestured to the chair across from him. She sat. He didn't. That was Colonel Patricia Wren, he said. Out of Central Command. She heads tactical assessment for the Southwestern Training Corridor. Emily kept her face neutral. She received the preliminary report this morning, Rush continued. My report. 3 pages. The raw after-action numbers, the casualty summary, the engagement metrics from the canyon. He paused. She had questions. What kind of questions? The kind you ask when you read an after-action report that includes a 340-meter precision engagement performed by a combat nurse. He sat down then, slowly, like a man settling the weight of a complicated day onto his chair. She is not, he said carefully, unsympathetic. Emily absorbed this. But she's also not able to simply set aside a formal protocol violation because the outcomes were good. The JAG inquiry proceeds regardless. I understood that. What she is, Rush said, is very interested in the background, the training history, your father's program. He looked at her steadily. She asked me whether any documentation exists. I don't know, Emily said. I told you last night, the training was real. It was formal in the sense that my father ran it the same way he ran training for his unit. But whether any of it was ever committed to paper outside of his personal records, I genuinely can't tell you. He kept thorough logs. What happened to those logs after he died? She stopped. I don't know. Colonel Wren is having someone look into it. Something shifted in her chest. Not hope exactly. She wasn't going to call it that yet. But the first suggestion of it, the outline of it. She also, Rush said, and his tone changed slightly, became more careful, more deliberate, has a different concern. One that the preliminary report raised but didn't answer. He opened a folder on the table. The ambush. Emily looked at him. The ambush was not random, he said. That's Wren's assessment, and I agree with it. 4 positions, pre-staged, covering all exit vectors. RPG capability on the western shelf. The shooter on the northern ridgeline, the late arrival, the one who was covering the exit route, he was there to prevent the convoy from retreating back the way it came. I noticed that, she said. Someone knew the convoy's route. The room was very quiet. Route 7 is a standard logistics corridor, she said slowly. 3 runs a week, you said. 3 runs a week on a rotating schedule. The schedule is internal. The specific timing, the window we were in on that road at that hour, that's not public. He closed the folder. Intelligence is already looking at it. Colonel Wren's office flagged it before she called me. A beat. This wasn't an opportunistic attack, Voss. Someone planned this, which means someone talked. She thought about the canyon, the 4 positions, the deliberate coverage, the RPG operator who had taken his time because he hadn't expected anyone to stop him. 17 people, she said. Yes. If it had worked, it would have been a massacre, and whoever arranged it would have walked away clean. He looked at her directly. The inquiry into your actions is still happening. I want to be clear about that. But it is now happening in a context that is significantly larger than one soldier's decision on a canyon shelf. She held his gaze. What does Colonel Wren want from me? Your full cooperation with the JAG investigation, which you've already agreed to. A detailed written account, not just your movements, but everything you observed on that drive. The pre-contact indicators. The bird movement you mentioned in debrief. He paused. You have a set of observational skills that the soldiers in those vehicles didn't apply. Wren wants to know everything you noticed that the official convoy record doesn't capture. I can do that. She also wants to know, Rush said, whether you recognized any tactical signature in the ambush layout, whether it suggested a particular training background, a particular methodology. Emily sat with that for a moment. You're asking me to do analysis that isn't in my job description, she said. I'm asking you to tell me what you saw. A pause. Whether that falls inside or outside your job description is a question for later. She thought about this canyon, the deliberate coverage, the way the positions had been staged to funnel rather than simply engage. The RPG operator's patience, the northern ridgeline position arriving late, which might have been a coordination lag or might have been deliberate, hold the escape route until the primary engagement was underway, then seal it. She thought about her father, who had spent 20 years studying how hostile actors planned and executed ambushes, and who had shared that curriculum with his daughter in the same systematic way he'd shared everything else. The layout suggests counter-mobility doctrine, she said, not standard insurgent engagement. The 4-point coverage isn't how you stage an ambush if your goal is maximum casualties from the initial strike. It's how you stage one if your goal is containment. You want to keep the convoy in the kill zone long enough to finish the job, not just hit it and scatter. She paused. The RPG was secondary. It was insurance, not the primary weapon, which is unusual. Usually, RPG capability is your opening move because it creates immediate chaos and covers your fighter's initial positioning. Staging it on the western shelf and holding it back until the primary engagement was established suggests the operators were disciplined enough to wait. Rush was watching her with an expression that she couldn't fully read. Whoever trained those fighters, she said, understood patience. They understood that a coordinated trap is more effective than a spectacular opening. That's not something you pick up informally. That's structured tactical education. He wrote something down. I want that in writing, he said. Today. Everything you just told me, with whatever additional detail you can add. He capped his pen. And Voss. She looked at him. Colonel Wren is coming to Redstone, he said. She'll be here in 36 hours. She wrote for 4 hours. The account ran to 12 pages by the time she set down her pen. Not the clean, summarized version of events she might have produced if she were trying to minimize her exposure, but the full thing. What she'd noticed on the drive. The tactical analysis she'd just given Rush, expanded and documented. The sequence of engagements on the shelf. Marsh's cardiac arrest, the CPR, the timeline, the return of pulse, the decision to go back to the rifle. She was honest about the order disobeying part. She didn't soften it or frame it in terms that made it look like something other than what it was. She had been told to stay behind cover, and she had not stayed behind cover. She had taken a weapon she was not authorized to operate. She had done both of these things knowing they were violations, and she had done them because the alternative was to watch 17 people be killed in a canyon. Whether that constituted justification or not was not her call to make. She put that in writing too. Danny brought food at noon that she mostly didn't eat. At some point, Teller came past the door of the small briefing room she'd commandeered, looked in, looked away. He didn't say anything, and she didn't either, but the fact that he'd paused at all was its own small data point. She filed the account with Rush's office at 1400 hours. At 14:15, a message arrived from the regional military hospital where Marsh had been taken. He was out of surgery. The TBI had been confirmed, a subdural hematoma treated successfully with a burr hole procedure. He was post-anesthesia and would need several days of monitoring, but the surgical team expected full recovery. She sat with that for longer than was strictly necessary. Full recovery. He was going to be okay. She thought about those 60 seconds on the shelf, the compressions, the counting, the round that had hit the stone 2 feet from her head, the moment she'd felt his pulse come back under her fingers. And she thought about how different things could have looked, how easily any single variable in that canyon could have resolved differently. She was not by nature someone who spent a lot of time on what if. It was a useless genre of thought, but she allowed herself 30 seconds of it, sitting in that briefing room with her finished account in front of her before she closed the door on it. Quote, Colonel Patricia Wren arrived not in 36 hours, but in 22. Emily heard about it from Rush's adjutant, who found her in the medical bay at 1100 the following morning. Wren had come in on an early flight, had gone directly to Rush's office, had spent 90 minutes there, and had then requested to see Captain Voss. She was not what Emily had expected, though she wasn't sure what she'd expected exactly. Wren was 53, lean and unhurried, with the kind of face that had been through enough to shed the need for expression management. She dressed like she'd been up since before dawn, which she probably had. She had Emily's 12-page account in her hand when she came into the briefing room, and she set it on the table between them before she sat down. I've read this twice, she said. Not a greeting, but not unfriendly either, just efficient. Yes, ma'am. I've also read Major Thomas Voss's training logs. She let that land. They took some finding. His personal records were archived with his personal effects after his death, forwarded to the estate, to you, I assume, and copies were retained at Fort Calloway and the Special Forces Administrative Archive. Nobody cross-referenced them to your service file because there was no reason to, and because the training you received was informal in the sense that it happened outside any official program structure, even though she opened the account to a specific page. The logs are remarkably detailed. Targets, distances, weather conditions, performance metrics, 15 years of records. Emily looked at her. I didn't know about the Fort Calloway copies. Most people don't know what's in administrative archives. Wren's expression didn't change much, but something in it sharpened. Your performance metrics at the end of the documented training program are consistent with a Tier 1 qualification standard. You were 23. The room was very quiet. I've been a nurse for 7 years, Emily said. I know. Wren looked at her steadily. I've also read your nursing record, your triage scores, your trauma response assessments, your field medicine certifications. A pause. You are currently one of approximately 30 people in the United States military who could have done what you did in that canyon yesterday. Maybe fewer. She closed the folder. And you've been filing long-range qualification requests that keep getting denied because nobody looked at the right archive. Emily held very still. The JAG inquiry is proceeding, Wren said. I want to be clear. I'm not here to shut it down. You disobeyed a direct order from your commanding officer. That has to be examined and it has to be documented. The inquiry will run its course. I understand, ma'am. What I'm here to do is ensure the inquiry has complete information, including the training history, including the tactical analysis in your account, which my team has already forwarded to the intelligence section examining the ambush. She paused. Your counter-mobility doctrine assessment is being corroborated by the physical evidence from the canyon, the staging pattern, the covered geometry. It matches a specific training framework that we've seen in 2 prior incidents in this corridor in the last 18 months. Emily sat forward slightly. Prior incidents. An equipment convoy was hit 8 months ago, lost 2 vehicles, 3 casualties. A reconnaissance team 3 months before that. The unit lost comms and came under fire at a position they shouldn't have been identifiable at. Wren's voice stayed even. Those incidents looked different enough that the connection wasn't immediately drawn. Your analysis, the counter-mobility framing, the patience element, the RPG staging as secondary, is the thread that ties them. Emily thought about the canyon road. About the birds? Someone has been feeding them route information, she said. All 3 convoys. That's the working theory. Wren looked at her. Which is why your presence in that canyon and what you did in it is about a great deal more than one soldier's decision to climb a rock face. The next 20 hours were not easy ones. The JAG investigators arrived mid-afternoon. 2 officers, Captain Lena Farrow and Major Dennis Obi, both of them professional and thorough and careful in the way people are careful when a case has become more complicated than the initial paperwork suggested. Emily sat across from them in the same briefing room for 3 hours and answered every question they asked, without evasion, without framing, with the same directness she'd put in the written account. Farrow was the one who pushed. You were given a direct order to stay behind cover, she said. Not accusatory, just precise. You understood that order? Yes. And you made a deliberate decision to disregard it? Yes. Based on your assessment of the tactical situation? Based on my assessment and the training background that enabled that assessment? Yes. An assessment that your commanding officer, who has 30 years of operational experience, did not share. Emily looked at her. Commander Rush didn't have the full information at that point. He knew I was a nurse. He didn't know what I could do with a precision rifle. My assessment was based on information he didn't have access to because it wasn't in my file. Farrow wrote something. So your position is that the order was given in good faith, but based on incomplete information. My position is that I disobeyed the order. The reasons for doing so are documented, and 17 people are alive. The inquiry will determine what that means procedurally. I'm not here to tell you what to conclude. Farrow looked at her for a moment. Obi, who had been mostly quiet, glanced up from his notes. Captain Voss, he said, did you at any point consider that disobeying the order and failing, whether from being shot during the climb, or from missing the targets, or from any other adverse outcome, would have resulted in significantly worse consequences for the convoy than if you'd stayed behind cover? She looked at him. Yes. And the RPG operator on the western shelf was 2 seconds from having a clear angle on the vehicle cluster. If I'd stayed behind cover and he'd fired, we'd have lost the primary vehicle cluster and everyone in it. The downside of the scenario you're describing was already arriving. She paused. There wasn't a low-risk option. There was the option where I climbed and it might work, or the option where I didn't climb and it definitely didn't. Obi wrote something. Farrow looked down at her notes, then back up. Colonel Wren has submitted documentation to this inquiry from the Fort Calloway archive. Have you reviewed that documentation? No, ma'am. It corroborates your account of the training history substantially. She paused. I want you to know that the documentation is being considered as part of the evidentiary record. That's not a conclusion. It's a statement of process. I understand. The interview ended at 1800. Emily went to the mess, ate something without paying attention to what it was, went back to her quarters, and sat on the edge of her bunk with her bandaged hand in her lap and the exhaustion of the last 36 hours pressing down on her in a way that she hadn't allowed it to during the hours when she'd needed to function. She was tired in a way that went past the physical. Tired in the way you get when you've spent a long time being something to someone, day after day, And then one afternoon, everything you actually are gets compressed into 43 minutes and played out in front of people who had decided who you were years before they met you. She lay back on the bunk. She did not sleep well, but she slept. The intelligence break came at 0400. She found out about it not from Rush, who was in an encrypted communication with Colonel Wren's office, and not from Wren's team directly, but from Teller, who knocked on her door at 0430 with the particular energy of a man carrying information he'd processed enough to know he should share. She opened the door in her uniform because she'd given up on sleep at 0345 and gotten dressed. "They found something," he said. She stepped back to let him in. He was not comfortable with this. She could see it, the slight awkwardness of a man who had not been in her quarters before and was aware of the history between them. But he came in and stood near the door and kept his voice low. "Intel section got a hit on the tactical training framework you identified," he said. "Counter-mobility doctrine, the staging pattern, the RPG is secondary. They ran it against a database of known operational signatures and got a partial match to a specific network, a group that's been active in this corridor for about 2 years. Moving equipment, running intelligence, providing tactical support to whoever pays them." He paused. The route information for all 3 convoy incidents apparently came from inside the base. Emily went still. "Inside Redstone," she said. "The investigation is active. They're not— Rush asked me to tell you that nobody in your unit is under formal suspicion at this point, but they're looking at comms, access logs, everything from the past 18 months. He met her eyes. "The 2 prior incidents, the equipment convoy, the recon team, those are being reopened." She thought about what Wren had said. This is about a great deal more than one soldier's decision to climb a rock face. "What does this mean for the inquiry?" she asked. "I don't know exactly. I don't think anyone does yet." He shifted his weight. "What I know is that Wren is still here. She was in Rush's office at midnight. The JAG team has been formally notified of the intelligence development." A pause. "Things are moving fast, Voss. Faster than I think any of us expected when this started." She nodded. He moved toward the door, then stopped. "For what it's worth," he said, "I pulled the Fort Callaway records myself this afternoon. Before Wren's office sent them to JAG, I asked Rush if I could see them, and he said yes." He looked at her steadily. "Your father ran a hell of a program." "I know," she said. "I should have—" He stopped, started again. "I should have asked more questions before I made up my mind, that's all." She held his gaze. "Yeah," she said, "you should have." He nodded once and left. At 700, Rush called her back into the command room. Wren was there, which she'd expected. What she hadn't expected were the 2 individuals she didn't recognize sitting against the wall. Civilian clothes, the kind of nondescript bearing that suggested the clothes were a choice rather than a default. One was a woman in her mid-40s with a notepad. The other was a man closer to 60 who had spent enough time in operational environments that it showed in the way he sat. Nobody introduced them. "Sit down, Voss," Rush said. She sat. "The intelligence section has a confirmed identity on the network behind the ambush," Wren said. She was standing, which seemed to be her preferred mode. "The analysis you provided was—" She paused for a fraction of a second. "Accurate. The counter-mobility signature matched. We have a name for the network, and we have a preliminary understanding of how the route information was being passed out of this corridor." Emily kept her face neutral. "The JAG inquiry," Wren continued, "is being temporarily suspended pending review of the broader investigation. This is not," she added preemptively, "a determination on the merits of your case. It's a procedural decision that reflects the extent to which your actions and the intelligence they generated have become intertwined with an active counterintelligence operation." "Temporarily suspended," Emily said. "The inquiry resumes when the counterintelligence situation is resolved, or when the reviewing authority determines that continuing them in parallel is feasible, whichever comes first." She looked at the 2 people against the wall. Neither of them returned the look with any particular expression. "What does this mean for my current assignment?" she asked. "You remain assigned to Redstone pending resolution." Rush answered this one. "Your duties continue. You are not under any restriction of movement or function." A pause. "You are not a subject of the counterintelligence investigation, Voss. I want to be clear about that." "But someone at this base is." Silence. Not a confirming silence, but not a denying one either. The kind of silence that meant she was right and they weren't in a position to say it. She thought about 11 weeks at Redstone, the people she'd worked with, formation every morning, 3 minutes early, teller in the armory doorway, Rush's office, the convoy briefing at 1400, the routine of a place where everyone knew what everyone else did, and the routine was the architecture of trust. Someone in that routine had handed a route schedule to a network staging counter-mobility ambushes in canyon corridors, and 3 of those ambushes had happened, and the third one had cost 2 people a medevac ride, and one of them a surgery, and 17 people a very specific kind of understanding of what it meant to nearly not come home. "If there's anything I can help with," she said carefully, "regarding the intelligence analysis." "We'll be in touch," Wren said. Emily looked at her, looked at the 2 people against the wall, looked at Rush. Something was moving here that she could feel the shape of without being able to see it clearly. The inquiry paused. Wren still in residence. 2 people in civilian clothes who hadn't been introduced. A counterintelligence investigation that had apparently moved fast enough in 24 hours to have a confirmed network identity. "Am I dismissed?" she asked. "One more thing," Wren said. She picked up a document from the table and held it but didn't hand it across. "Colonel Wren's office, my office, is formally requesting that the Fort Callaway training records be added to your permanent service file. That request has been submitted to the appropriate administrative authority." She paused. "The process takes time, but it's been submitted." Emily looked at the document. 15 years of her father's training logs. Distances. Weather conditions. Performance metrics. The record of everything he'd taught her, committed to paper in his careful handwriting, sitting in an archive at Fort Callaway because no one had ever thought to look. Going into her file. She kept her face composed. She was good at that. "Thank you, ma'am," she said. Wren set the document down. "Dismissed, Captain." She was halfway across the motor pool when she heard boots behind her. Fast, purposeful. And she turned. It was Rush's adjutant, slightly out of breath. "Ma'am, Commander Rush asked that you return to the command room." She turned, looked at him. He was 24, efficient, unreadable by training, but right now his jaw was set in a way that told her the request was not routine. "Now?" she said. "Now, ma'am." She went back. The room had changed in the 4 minutes she'd been gone. Wren was on the phone, turned away from the room, voice low and clipped. One of the 2 civilians was gone. The other, the woman with the notepad, was on her own phone, saying nothing, just listening. Rush was at the head of the table. He looked at Emily when she came in, and the expression on his face was the one she'd never seen on him before. The one that meant the situation had moved past the point where operational experience alone was enough to navigate it. "There's been a development," he said. She waited. "The source of the route information," he said. "They've identified who it is." She held very still. "It's not a soldier," he said. "It's a contractor. Logistics and maintenance been embedded with this unit for 14 months. He paused. "He was on the convoy." The canyon, the burning vehicles, 17 people on the floor of a kill zone that had been designed with precision and patience. "He was on the convoy," she said. "Vehicle 6. Rush's voice was flat and controlled, but she'd learned to read the flatness. "He survived. He's currently on base." Another pause, and this one was different. "He made a phone call 40 minutes ago. We were monitoring." "Who did he call?" "We don't know yet. The call was brief and the number routes through 3 countries. Rush held her gaze. "What we know is what he said." She waited. "He said the convoy didn't go as planned," Rush said. He said... He looked down at a paper in front of him, reading it. "She killed them all. There's a woman here who killed them all. They need to know about her." The room was very quiet. Wren was still on her phone. The remaining civilian had stopped listening to hers and was watching Emily. Emily stood in the middle of the room and absorbed what Rush had just told her, the shape of it, the weight of it, the specific way in which the last 48 hours had just rearranged themselves into something larger and more dangerous than a JAG inquiry and a temporarily suspended investigation. Whoever had planned the canyon ambush now knew she existed, knew her name, or would, knew she'd taken 4 positions from a shelf 35 feet above the canyon floor and saved the convoy they'd designed to be unsavable. And they had told someone. "Where is he now?" she asked. Security has him, Rush said. He doesn't know we were monitoring. A pause. He will be questioned. And the people he called are being worked by people who do that kind of work. He held her gaze. This is beyond Redstone now, Voss. This is beyond Colonel Wren's office. There are people from agencies I can't name to you in this room who arrived in the last hour. He let that land. What I need you to understand is that your exposure— My exposure just changed, she said. Yes. She stood there. Outside the window, the desert stretched toward the ridgelines in the hard morning light. And it was the same desert it had always been, vast and indifferent and full of distance in every direction. And somewhere out beyond those ridgelines, someone had just received a phone call about a woman who'd survived something they'd built to be unsurvivable. She was not afraid. She searched for the right word, standing in that room with all of those people who were watching her, and the word she found was not the one she expected. She was ready. And then Wren ended her call, turned around, and looked at Emily with an expression that made the air in the room change completely. They just found a secondary contact, Wren said, in the base communications log, a second person. She paused. Someone with medical access. The word hit the room like something physical. Medical access. Emily watched Wren's face and did the math fast. The way you do when information arrives, and you have to decide whether it means what it sounds like it means, or whether you're pattern matching your way into a conclusion that isn't there yet. The base medical unit was small, 7 people including herself, Danny Oakes, 2 other medics, an administrative specialist who managed the pharmaceutical inventory, a physician's assistant named Barrett, who had been at Redstone for 9 months, and a medical logistics coordinator named Warren Sully, who had been there longer than anyone else in the unit and who had access to every convoy medical manifest, which meant access to every convoy schedule, which meant medical access, she said. You mean the medical unit? Wren looked at her. I mean someone whose base access is categorized under medical operations. How many people does that cover? We're narrowing it. Wren's voice was measured. Captain Voss, I need you to understand that what I've just told you is preliminary. The communications analysis is ongoing. We do not have a name yet. But you have a category. We have a category. Wren held her gaze. I'm telling you because you work in that unit, and because the people in this room have decided you are someone who should be informed rather than managed. A pause. Do you understand the distinction? She understood it. Informed meant they trusted her. Managed meant they would have told her to go to the medical bay and wait while other people handled the situation around her. Informed meant she was part of the operational picture now. What do you need from me? She said. Nothing yet. Possibly something later. Wren turned back to the phone. You're dismissed for now. Don't discuss this with anyone in your unit. Emily left. She walked back across the motor pool in the same hard morning light, and she did not look like a woman who had just been told that someone she worked with, someone who had access to the same medical bay she slept 30 feet from, the same pharmaceutical inventory she'd restocked at 0203 nights ago, had potentially fed route information to a network that staged precision ambushes in canyon corridors. She looked like a combat nurse walking back to her station. She had learned, a long time ago, that looking like what you were was the best possible cover. The next 6 hours were the longest kind of waiting, the kind with work in it. She ran her morning sick call. 3 soldiers with minor complaints, one with a developing respiratory infection she caught early enough to matter. She restocked the trauma kits that had been depleted during the convoy response. She updated patient records. She did everything that the day required of her with the same attention she always brought to it, because the work was real regardless of everything happening around it. And sick soldiers didn't stop being sick because the base was in the middle of a counterintelligence operation. Danny Oakes watched her from across the medical bay for most of the morning with the expression of someone who knew something had shifted but couldn't identify what. You're quiet, he said, around 1000. I'm always quiet. Quieter than quiet. He handed her a chart. Russia's adjutant came by twice asking for you. I know. I talked to the commander this morning. He waited to see if more was coming. It wasn't. Okay, he said, and went back to his work. She respected him for not pushing. He was learning when to read a room. At 11:40, Warren Sully walked into the medical bay. He was 47, medium build, the kind of unremarkable physical presence that faded into background easily. He had been at Redstone for 16 months, handled medical logistics with quiet competence, and in 11 weeks, Emily had developed no particular opinion of him beyond the baseline professional assessment of someone who did his job adequately and didn't cause problems. She watched him now the way you watch a room, when you've been told there's something wrong in it, but you don't know what. He moved to the pharmaceutical cabinet, unlocked it, began checking inventory against a manifest on his clipboard, routine, the kind of thing he did twice a week. His hands were steady. His breathing was even. His attention appeared to be on the manifest. Emily went back to the chart she was reviewing and did not stare at him, because staring at him was information she wasn't prepared to give yet. He finished the inventory check in 11 minutes, relocked the cabinet, initialed the manifest, and left without particular hurry. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The name came at 1300, not from Wren's office directly, from Rush, who appeared in the doorway of the medical bay with his adjutant and the flat, contained expression he used when information required delivery in person. "Voss?" he said. "A moment?" She followed him to the corridor. "Warren Sully," Rush said. Quietly. Not a question. She kept her face neutral. "When?" "Communications analysis completed an hour ago. The second contact in the base log routes to a device registered to a shell company with ties to the same network as the contractor. Sully accessed the convoy scheduling system on 3 separate occasions over the past 14 months that don't correspond to any legitimate medical logistics function." He paused. "The access patterns match all 3 convoy incidents." She thought about him at the pharmaceutical cabinet that morning. Steady hands, even breathing. "He doesn't know," she said. "We don't believe so. The monitoring is passive. He hasn't been approached." Rush looked at her steadily. "The agencies involved are determining the best approach. They want to understand the full network before they move." "How long?" "Days, possibly less." He held her gaze. "In the meantime, you continue your duties as normal. If Sully interacts with you in any way that seems, I'll document it," she said. "Don't confront him." "I understand." "I mean that, Voss." She looked at him. "I heard you the first time." He studied her for a moment, like he was gauging whether the look she'd given him had been compliance or something more complicated. She let him gauge. He nodded once and walked away. She stood in the corridor for a moment and thought about Warren Sully's steady hands. The investigators moved faster than anyone had indicated they would. By 1500 that afternoon, the base had a different texture to it. Not dramatically, not in ways that an inattentive person would notice, but Emily had been paying close attention to the texture of things for her entire adult life, and she noticed. 2 vehicles in the motor pool that hadn't been there at noon. A cluster of people near the communications building who weren't in any unit she recognized. Rush's adjutant making rounds with the particular efficiency of someone executing a time-sensitive checklist. Something was happening on a timeline she hadn't been told. At 15:45, Danny Oakes found her in the supply room. "Sully didn't show up for the 1,500 inventory cross-check," he said. She looked up from the shelf she was organizing. "Okay." "That's the second time this week," he frowned. "Garrett asked me to log it." A pause. "Is something going on?" "Document the absence," she said. "Follow the standard protocol for that." He looked at her with the expression he'd had all morning, the one that said he knew she knew something. "Danny." She held his gaze. "Document the absence, follow protocol. That's all." He heard the weight in it this time, even without explanation. He nodded and left. 3 minutes later, her radio crackled with Wren's call sign. "Captain Voss. Conference room B, now." Conference room B was not where high-level operational discussions usually happened. It was smaller, plainer, closer to the motor pool than the command section, the kind of room used for logistical coordination and shift change briefings. The choice of location was itself information. They'd moved deliberately out of the command room, out of the central building, into a space where 2 vehicles and a cluster of unidentifiable personnel could be 20 meters away without attracting the attention that the same activity near the command room would generate. She understood then that the operation was already running. Wren was in the room with the two civilians, both of them now, the woman with the notepad and the older man who hadn't spoken yesterday. There was also a third person, a younger man in a contractor's vest and desert boots, who had the quiet attention of someone whose job description didn't exist on any official paperwork. "Sit down," Wren said. Emily sat. "Sully attempted to make a second call at 14:20 hours, Wren said. "The call was intercepted. It was brief, 12 seconds, and it was terminated before he could transmit any substantial content. We believe he was attempting to report on the counterintelligence activity he'd observed this morning, specifically the additional vehicles and personnel." "He noticed," Emily said. "He's been doing this for 14 months. He knows what normal looks like." Wren's voice was flat. "Which means the window for a passive approach closed approximately 40 minutes ago." The older man against the wall, who still hadn't been introduced, spoke for the first time. His voice was unhurried and quiet, the kind of voice that got that way from years of choosing words carefully. "We have enough to move on both him and the contractor," he said. "The network identification is solid. The communications trail is solid. The access pattern to the convoy scheduling system is documented and cross-referenced to 3 incidents. He looked at Emily. "What we don't have yet is the full upstream picture, who Sully reports to directly, whether there are other nodes in this network operating in this corridor." "Which is what you were hoping to get from monitoring," she said. "Correct. And now you can't." "The risk calculus changed when he tried to make that second call." He paused. "We moved tonight." She looked around the room, at Wren, at the unnamed man, at the young contractor who was probably not a contractor. "Why am I here?" she asked. The question landed without particular edge. She said it the way she said most things, flat and direct. But it was the right question, and everyone in the room knew it. She was a combat nurse. She had no counterintelligence function. She had no investigative authority. The people in this room were capable of conducting whatever operation they were planning without her presence or her knowledge. Wren and the older man exchanged a look that was brief and conclusive, the kind of look that meant a decision had already been made, and this was the execution of it. "Because of the phone call the contractor made," Wren said. "The one where he said she killed them all." A pause. "The network now has information that you exist, that you performed the engagements in the canyon. The upstream contact, whoever the contractor and Sully report to, received that information within the window of that call, and they've had 36 hours to act on it." Emily held still. "Act on it how?" she said. "We don't know yet, but assets like you, people who can do what you did in that canyon, represent known quantity to networks that stage military ambushes. They don't ignore them." The older man was watching her with the steady attention of someone accustomed to delivering complicated truths. "There may be a move against you personally. There may not. We don't have the intelligence to say for certain. You're telling me I'm a target. We're telling you you may be a target, and that the people in this room consider your safety a significant operational priority, which is why you're here instead of finding this out from someone who isn't in this room." A pause. "We're also telling you that your presence on this base and what you know from the past 72 hours makes you a potential asset in what happens tonight." She absorbed this. Outside, the desert afternoon was doing what it always did, baking, indifferent, enormous. Somewhere on this base, Warren Sully was going about whatever he was going about, not knowing that 12 seconds of a failed phone call had closed the window on 14 months of access. And somewhere beyond the base, some upstream node in a network that built counter-mobility ambushes with patience and precision had a piece of information about her. She thought about patience, about the way the RPG operator on the Western Shelf had waited. She thought about what it meant when disciplined, patient people received unexpected information. "What do you need from me?" she asked. Well, what they needed was not dramatic. She went back to the medical bay. She ran her 1600 duties. She ate dinner in the mess at 1800, same table she always used, same conversation pattern she always had, because Sully ate at the same time, and the goal was a baseline evening that looked like every other evening. Sully sat across the mess from her and ate a plate of the same indifferent food that everyone else ate and talked to the medic named Barrett about something she couldn't hear from across the room, and he looked exactly the same as he always had. That was the worst part, she thought. Not the danger, not the weight of the operation moving around her, not even the thought of what he'd done. It was the mundanity of him, The way people who did serious damage to other people could look so thoroughly, unremarkably ordinary. She ate her food. She didn't look at him any more than she usually would. She went back to her quarters at 1900, as she usually did. At 2100, Danny Oakes knocked on her door with the particular knock he'd developed over the past 3 days for occasions when he had information he didn't know what to do with. She opened the door. His face was off. Not frightened exactly, but tight in the way it got when he was processing something and didn't have a frame for it. "Sully just left the base," he said. "I saw him heading to the vehicle gate. He had a bag." She kept her face neutral. "Okay. He didn't sign out. I checked the motor pool log because I was returning equipment, and I checked. He didn't sign out a vehicle. He didn't log a departure. He just—" Danny stopped. "Emily, what's happening?" She looked at him for a moment. 3 weeks at Redstone, 19 years old, good instincts, and the kind of backbone that was still deciding how much weight it could carry. "Go back to the medical bay," she said. "Stay there. Don't call anyone. If someone from the command section comes looking for me, tell them I'm in my quarters." "Are you... Danny?" She held his eyes. This is one of those times where following instructions exactly is the most important thing you can do. Do you understand? He swallowed, nodded. She was already reaching for her radio. Wren's response came in 40 seconds. "We see him," Wren said. "He's on foot, moving northeast toward the maintenance perimeter. We have eyes." A pause, crisp. "Stay in your quarters, Captain." "He's making a run," Emily said. "We have eyes on him." The maintenance perimeter has 3 access points to the eastern service road. If he has transport pre-staged, "Captain Voss, stay in your quarters." The radio went quiet. She stood in the center of her quarters and counted the options. Wren had people positioned. They'd anticipated a flight risk. The operation was designed for exactly this scenario. She had been told to stay, and staying was the tactically correct choice for someone without a counterintelligence function, without a law enforcement designation, without any authority in what was currently happening. She stayed. For approximately 90 seconds. Then the sound she heard through the thin walls of the base quarters, distant, on the northeast perimeter, was not the sound of a clean apprehension. It was the sound of something going wrong. A vehicle, moving fast where vehicles shouldn't be moving fast. A shout. Radio traffic bleeding through frequencies that crackled in her earpiece without resolving into language. She was out the door. Not running. Moving fast, purposeful, with the controlled gait of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Northeast. The maintenance perimeter. The eastern service road. The base at 2100 hours was not empty. It was a working forward operating position. But it wasn't crowded either, and she moved through it the way she'd moved through the canyon floor. Low profile, fast, looking like someone with a legitimate reason to be going exactly where she was going. She reached the maintenance perimeter in 3 minutes. The scene she found was controlled chaos, which was different from regular chaos only in that people were controlling it. 2 vehicles at angles that indicated a fast stop. 4 individuals in the operational gear that the younger man from the conference room and his equivalents tended to wear. A 5th figure on the ground, not Sully, with his hands behind his back and his face pressed to the dirt of the service road. And Sully, 10 meters beyond the perimeter fence in the open desert, backing away from the lights. He had a phone in his hand. He was not running anymore. Emily stopped at the fence line and assessed. The operational team had a clear surround on 3 sides. The 4th side was open desert. Sully had backed into the triangle of the perimeter lights and the team's positioning, and he had nowhere productive to go, which meant the phone in his hand was not a communication device right now. It was a negotiating chip or an information release or a detonator for something she couldn't see. She took in his body language, the angle of his shoulders, the way he held the phone, not like someone about to make a call, like someone about to do something irrevocable with it. Wren's voice in her earpiece. "Voss, I told you to stay put." "What's on the phone?" Emily said, low into the radio. A pause. "We believe it may be a data package, compiled intelligence on base operations, convoy schedules, personnel. If he transmits—" "He's not trying to transmit," Emily said. "Look at how he's holding it." A pause, shorter this time. "What are you seeing?" "He's going to destroy it. The phone. He knows you're going to take it, and he's calculating whether what's on it is worth more to his network secured or gone." She watched him. His thumb was moving on the screen. not a call interface. Settings, possibly a wipe function, if he had one configured. He's got maybe 30 seconds before he either wipes it or drops it. Another pause. Talk him down, Wren said. You're standing at the fence. He can see you. The team approaching is escalating him. A single voice. I'm not a negotiator. You're the only person at that fence line right now. Wren's voice was completely even. Talk him down. Emily looked at Sully through the fence. 16 months at Redstone. 3 convoys compromised. 3 incidents that had killed equipment, injured soldiers, and on the 3rd occasion come within a functioning RPG angle of a massacre. She opened the fence gate. Sully, she said. He looked at her. His thumb stopped moving. Whatever you're about to do to that phone, she moved toward him slowly. Not tactical, not threatening, the way she moved toward someone on a gurney who didn't want to be touched. It's not going to change what we already have, the communications log, the access patterns, the scheduling entries that don't match any medical function. She kept walking, easy, measured. The phone doesn't matter. We have enough. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face in 11 weeks, because he'd never needed to show it. Desperate calculation. The arithmetic of a person trying to find an exit in a room that has run out of doors. You should have stayed in your quarters, he said. His voice was flat. Yeah. She stopped 6 feet from him. People keep telling me that. His thumb moved on the screen again. Sully. She kept her voice level. You worked in the same building as 17 people who almost died in that canyon. You knew what you were setting up. You knew what the ambush was designed to do. She held his gaze. There is nothing on that phone worth what you already have to carry. Destroying it doesn't change any of that. He looked at her for a long moment. His thumb stopped. The operational team moved in quiet and fast and had him to the ground in under 4 seconds, and she stepped back and let them work. And the phone was in an evidence bag before he'd finished processing that he was down. She stood in the open desert with the perimeter lights behind her and the night sky above, and the long flat nothing of the Nevada desert in every direction, and she was shaking again, the same way she'd shaken after the canyon, the same settling of accounts that happened when the urgent thing was over. She made fists, opened them. Wren was at the fence line. She looked at Emily with the expression she had when she was adjusting her assessment of something. I told you to stay in your quarters, she said. You did, Emily agreed. That phone has intelligence value we weren't certain we'd recover. I know. You couldn't have known for certain that he was about to wipe it. No, she said, but it's what I would have done. Wren looked at her for a moment that stretched slightly. Then she turned back toward the operational team and the scene they were managing. Get some sleep, Captain, she said. Tomorrow is going to be a long day. Tomorrow was a longer day than anyone had indicated. The counterintelligence teams worked through the night. By 0600, Emily heard through Rush's adjutant that the contractor, the one who had been in Vehicle 6 on the convoy, the one who had made the phone call, had been formally arrested and transferred to a detention facility outside the base. By 800, she heard that Sully had waived his right to silence and was cooperating with investigators, which she found both unsurprising and grimly informative. People who spent 14 months building slow, patient intelligence operations for external networks tended to be pragmatists. When the exit route closed, they calculated. By 1000, the base had returned to something resembling its ordinary texture, which was its own kind of strange. The way places snapped back to apparent normalcy even when the thing that had disrupted them was still actively being processed. She ran sick call, updated records, restocked trauma kits. At 11:30, Rush called her into his office. He was alone, which was itself information. He'd spent 3 days in rooms full of people with authority levels above his, navigating an investigation that had expanded past anything that had been visible from the canyon floor, and the fact that this conversation was just him and her felt deliberate. He looked tired. She hadn't noticed that before. He was the kind of man whose structure held even when the contents were depleted, but it was there now. The JAG inquiry, he said. She waited. Colonel Wren's office has formally submitted a request to the reviewing authority for expedited consideration. Given the scope of what's developed in the past 72 hours, the counterintelligence aspect, the corroboration of your training background, the combat outcomes, They're requesting that the inquiry be resolved quickly rather than held in suspension indefinitely. He paused. I've added a commanding officer's recommendation to that request. She looked at him. What kind of recommendation? The kind that reflects what I believe actually happened in that canyon, he said, which is that a soldier with documented precision marksmanship capability, facing an active mass casualty threat, made a sound tactical decision under impossible conditions and saved 17 lives. He held her gaze. The order violation is real. I can't make it not real, and I wouldn't try. But context is also real, and the reviewing authority deserves the full context. She said nothing for a moment. Thank you, she said finally. He nodded. There was something in his expression, not quite discomfort, but adjacent to it, that suggested this was the part of the conversation he'd been thinking about. Voss, the 11 weeks, you don't have to. I do. He stopped. The long-range qualification requests, the way I framed your role here, the conversations I didn't have with you that I should have had. He was not a man who did this easily. She could see the effort of it, but he was doing it anyway. I looked at your file and I saw a nurse with exceptional medical credentials. I should have looked further. I should have asked questions. A pause. I was wrong about the limits of your file, and he seemed to look for the right word. I was too fast to define what you were before I knew who you were. That affected decisions I made. I own that. She looked at him. She thought about 11 weeks of 3 minutes early formations, the requests that came back denied, teller in the doorway, the accumulated weight of a place that had already decided what she was before it bothered to look. She thought about her father's logs in an archive at Fort Calloway, 15 years of careful documentation sitting unread in an administrative file because nobody had thought to look. It costs time, she said. The 11 weeks. I know. Not just here. The 3 prior convoy incidents. If the training history had been in my file from the start. I know, he said again, quietly, taking it. She could have said more. There was more to say. About the specific arithmetic of what gets lost when people are categorized before they're known. About the convoys that had gone wrong before hers. About soldiers who'd been hurt in incidents that a different set of eyes on the right canyon ridgeline might have prevented. She didn't say it, not because it wasn't true, because it was, and he was already carrying it, and adding weight to what a person is already carrying, honestly, doesn't accomplish what the anger wants it to accomplish. The inquiry, she said. Whatever the result is, we'll deal with it, he said. Together, if that's acceptable. She nodded. He picked up a folder from his desk and set it in front of her. There's one more thing. She looked at the folder. Colonel Wren submitted a proposal to the reviewing authority, he said, separate from the inquiry recommendation. A proposal for a pilot program. She's calling it a hybrid designation, a formal military role that combines combat medical qualification with precision marksmanship at a Tier 1 level. It doesn't currently exist in any doctrinal framework. Wren is arguing that the events of the canyon demonstrate a tactical gap that the proposal addresses. He paused. She wants to pilot the program with one test case. Emily looked at the folder. She did not open it. She listed you as the proposed test case, Rush said, by name, with the Fort Calloway records as the evidential foundation. She sat for a moment with the shape of it. Everything her father had taught her, the distances, the conditions, the breathing, the patience, alongside everything she'd built in the years after, the triage scores and the trauma certifications, and the 11 weeks of pre-dawn formation that nobody had noticed. 2 things that had never been allowed to be in the same room, occupying the same designation, the same file, the same sentence. She opened the folder. Inside, Wren's proposal, 12 pages, clean and precise. Her name on the first page, not as a nurse who had overstepped, but as the foundational evidence for a new category of capability that the military had apparently needed and not known how to name. She read the first page. She read it again. She set it down. The inquiry still has to run, she said. Yes. And whatever it determines, the proposal is independent of the inquiry outcome, Rush said. Wren made that explicit. She says the tactical case for the program stands regardless of the protocol determination. A pause. I tend to agree with her. Emily closed the folder. She thought about Sully being questioned somewhere on this base, doing the arithmetic of cooperation. She thought about the contractor in a detention facility outside Silver Ridge. She thought about the network that had staged 3 ambushes in this corridor, and somewhere upstream of Sully and the contractor, a node that had received a 12-second call about a woman who had survived something they'd built to be unsurvivable. The phone with the intelligence package was in an evidence bag. The network was being worked from multiple directions. The upstream contact was, according to the last thing she'd heard from Wren's office, a known entity with a case file that had just gotten significantly more actionable. The trap was closing, but not entirely. Not yet. At 1400, her radio crackled with Wren's call sign. Captain Voss, Conference Room B? She was already up. Conference Room B held Wren and the older man and 2 new faces, people she hadn't seen before, with a different kind of attention in their posture, the kind that had come a long distance quickly for a specific reason. Sit down, Wren said. Emily sat. The upstream contact, Wren said. The person Sully and the contractor reported to. She paused. We have an identification. Emily waited. The identification came from the intelligence package on Sully's phone, which your intervention last night preserved. She looked at Emily steadily. The contact is not abroad. The contact is not in another state. The contact has been operating inside the Southwestern Training Corridor for the past 2 years. Another pause. And this one was different. The kind of pause that precedes information that reorganizes everything. The contact has Department of Defense contractor credentials. They have access to base scheduling systems across 4 forward operating positions in this corridor, including Redstone. Emily held very still. They were at Redstone, Wren said. Last week, 3 days before the convoy. And then the older man, who had been quiet until now, looked at Emily and said the one thing that made every piece of the last 72 hours reorganize itself into a shape she hadn't seen coming. The credentials, he said, are registered to someone in a medical logistics role. He paused. And according to the access logs we pulled this morning, they were in the convoy scheduling system the night before the mission. He set a photograph on the table in front of her. Emily looked at it, and the face looking back at her from the photograph was not one she'd seen at Redstone, not one she'd spoken to in the canyon, not one she'd encountered in any of the rooms she'd been in over the past 3 days. It was the face of the flight medic who had taped her hand after the medevac, the woman who had said, "Buy me a coffee." The photograph sat on the table between them, and Emily looked at it for a long time without speaking. The flight medic. Mid-40s, competent hands, the no-nonsense focus of someone who had done 100 medevac handoffs. Buy me a coffee. The easy familiarity of it. The way she'd taped Emily's hand without being asked and gone back to her patients. The whole texture of her, so thoroughly the thing she appeared to be that Emily had cataloged her as background, as context, as the professional machinery of a system doing what it was supposed to do. 14 months of Sully. 16 months of the contractor. 2 years of someone moving through 4 forward operating positions with DoD credentials and a medical logistics categorization and access to scheduling systems that fed route information to a network that killed people in canyons. She picked up the photograph. Her name, Emily said. Sandra Pruitt, Wren said. 46. Former Army logistics specialist, honorably discharged 9 years ago, contracted back in through a private medical logistics firm with DoD clearance. The firm has 3 other government contracts. We're pulling those now. A pause. The medevac unit she flew with is based out of Fort Dunmore, 40 miles northeast. She's been on their rotation for 11 months. Emily thought about the canyon, the medevac arriving in rotor wash and dust, the clinical efficiency of the handoff. The way Pruitt had assessed Marsh, Okafor, Briggs had moved through the work with the authority of someone who'd earned it over years. She thought about how much you could do from a medevac rotation, how many bases you could touch, how many casualty handoffs meant access to personnel rosters, scheduling logs, the organic operational data of a unit under stress. She knew about the convoy before it happened, Emily said. It wasn't a question. Sully fed her the schedule, the older man said. 3 days prior. She was the coordination point. Not an executor, not a fighter, but the person who took the information from sources like Sully and the contractor and translated it into operational packages for the network's tactical arm. He paused. The 3 convoy series was her architecture. The ambush in the canyon was her design. Emily set the photograph down. The RPG operator who had waited on the western shelf. The disciplined 4-point coverage. The northern ridgeline position as a delayed seal. The counter-mobility doctrine she'd identified in her written account and in Russia's command room, which Wren's team had confirmed as a signature. A former logistics specialist who understood base operations, convoy patterns, and medical access points had designed an ambush that nearly killed 17 people and then shown up in a medevac helicopter to collect the survivors. The audacity of it was almost hard to process. "Where's she now?" Emily asked. "Fort Dunmore," Wren said. "She reported for her shift at 0700 this morning. She doesn't know we have the phone. She doesn't know about Sully's cooperation." A pause. "She will." "When?" "She's being taken into custody as we speak." The arrest happened at 14:47 hours, according to the timeline Emily received through Russia's office 4 hours later. She wasn't there for it. She was in the medical bay, running afternoon duties, doing the things that the day required of her, which was both ordinary and entirely dissonant in the way that the ordinary becomes when it's laid over something seismic. Danny Oakes worked beside her and didn't ask questions, which she appreciated. At 1700, Rush appeared in the medical bay doorway. "Pruitt is in custody," he said. He said it simply, without ceremony, which was the right way. Fort Dunmore CID, with federal support, she was taken from the medevac unit staging area. A pause. She asked for a lawyer before they finished the first sentence. "Good," Emily said. He looked at her, slightly surprised. "That's how it's supposed to work," she said. "She gets a lawyer, it gets processed correctly." She set down the chart she was updating. "All of it goes through the right channels and comes out the other side with results that hold." He nodded slowly. "The inquiry," he said, "the reviewing authority has received Wren's recommendation and my recommendation and the Fort Calloway documentation. They've expedited the review." A pause. "We should have a determination within the week." She absorbed this. "And Wren's proposal?" "Moving through channels. These things take longer than a week." He paused. "But they're moving." She nodded. He was still in the doorway, which meant there was something else. "The soldiers from the convoy," he said, "a number of them have asked, through me, informally, whether they could address you. As a group. Not formally, not on the record, just—" He paused, seeming to feel for the right framing. "Just to say something they wanted to say." She looked at him. "When?" "Tonight, if you're willing. The motor pool. After 2000. She looked at the chart in her hands, at the medical bay around her, at Danny Oakes, who was very studiously not listening. "Okay," she said. It was not a ceremony. Nobody had arranged chairs or prepared remarks or designated a spokesperson. It was just soldiers, 11 of them from the convoy, some still showing the physical evidence of the contact in the form of bandages and careful movement, gathered in the motor pool at 2030 with the kind of awkward directness that happens when military people decide to do something that doesn't have a drill for it. Teller was there. He stood at the back and didn't say much, which seemed to be his contribution. Rush was not there, which was deliberate and correct. This wasn't for him. Briggs was there, sitting on a vehicle bumper with his leg in a brace, which meant he'd been transferred back from the regional hospital in the last 24 hours. He looked like someone who had won an argument with his own body through sheer stubbornness and was aware of the victory. He was the one who spoke first. "I'm not good at this," he said, which was the most honest opening anyone could have chosen. "I'm not going to stand here and make a speech, but I was conscious enough on that canyon floor to know that the situation was bad and getting worse, and then it got better, and it got better because of you." He met her eyes. "That matters. I wanted you to know that it matters to the people it happened to, not just on paper." Nobody cheered. Nobody clapped. It wasn't that kind of moment. The soldier who had shouted, "Who the hell is shooting?" She'd found out his name was Corporal Ree, 22 years old, 3 years in, was standing near the front of the group and he didn't say anything. He just looked at her with the steady, slightly raw expression of someone who has been in close proximity to death and has been recalibrating their relationship to things ever since. She looked back at him. That was enough. One of the medics, a sergeant named Price, who she'd spoken to maybe twice in 11 weeks, said, "We didn't know. Most of us didn't know anything about your background, and I think, he paused, collecting himself. I think that's something we should sit with, because if we had known, or if there'd been a culture here where we asked instead of assumed, it might have mattered before the canyon. That one landed in the group with the particular weight of a true thing. She stood in front of them, and she was not moved in the performed way of films and stories. She did not have tears ready, did not have a speech prepared, but she was genuinely moved in the way that happens when people see you, actually see you, and you've spent a long time in rooms where they didn't. I'm not good at this either, she said. So I'm just going to say, I did what I could do with what I had, same as all of you did. She paused. The person who really deserves to be here is Corporal Marsh. When he's back on his feet, buy him a drink. Briggs laughed, which broke something in the air, and for a few minutes it was just people talking, the loose and genuine kind, without rank or agenda or the formal architecture of a military base telling them how to arrange themselves. At some point, Teller materialized beside her at the edge of the group. Price was right, he said. It cost him something to say it. And she could see that it did. About the culture. About asking instead of assuming. Yeah, she said. I've been thinking about that. Good, she said. That's the right thing to be thinking about. He almost smiled. Almost. You're not going to make this easy on me. I'm going to make it exactly as easy as it should be, she said, which is not very, but not impossible either. He nodded at that, and she thought he'd heard what she meant. Not cruelty, not punishment, just the appropriate difficulty of changing something real. He walked away and left her with the rest of the group, and she stayed until the motor pool thinned out naturally, until the only people left were Briggs on his bumper and Danny Oakes, who had apparently followed her there without her noticing. Were you going to tell me you were coming? She said. Seemed like you might want backup, he said, in case it got weird. It wasn't weird. No, he agreed. He looked at the empty motor pool. It was good, right? She thought about it. Yeah, she said. It was good. The JAG determination came 5 days later. Not with fanfare, with a memo. She was in her quarters at 0630 when Rush's adjutant knocked, and she took the envelope, and she sat on the edge of her bunk and opened it with the same deliberate attention she'd given to every other document in this process. The reviewing authority had found that Captain Emily Voss had disobeyed a direct order from her commanding officer during an active combat situation. This finding stood on the record and could not be set aside. She read that paragraph twice. The reviewing authority had also found, on review of the totality of evidence, including documented training records, tactical analysis corroborated by physical evidence, combat outcomes, and the commanding officer's recommendation that the disobedience of the order had been predicated on accurate tactical assessment in a time-critical situation with documented mass casualty risk, and that the outcome of the actions taken had directly prevented significant loss of life. The determination recommended a formal notation in her service record acknowledging the protocol violation. It also recommended, in a separate and formal notation, recognition of her actions for valor under fire. Both notations. Both true. Both on the record. She set the memo down. She sat for a moment. The violation stood because it had happened, and pretending it hadn't wasn't something the process could do or should do. The recognition stood because 17 people had come home. Neither one erased the other. Both of them were real, and they were going to sit in her file together for the rest of her service, which seemed to her to be the most honest possible outcome. Her father had always said that the record is what it is. You can't choose what goes in it. You can only choose what you put in. She picked up the memo again. Read the recognition paragraph one more time. Then she got dressed and went to work. The public accounting came in stages, the way these things always do. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in an accumulation of smaller ones, each of which mattered in its own way. Pruitt was transferred to federal custody 8 days after her arrest at Fort Dunmore. The charges included conspiracy to commit aggravated assault against military personnel, providing material support to a foreign-linked hostile network, and multiple counts related to the specific convoy incidents. The federal prosecutor's office had Sully's cooperation, the contractor's cooperation, the intelligence package from the phone, and 2 years of communications logs that the network had apparently believed were adequately secured. They were not adequately secured. The network's tactical arm, the fighters who had staged the canyon ambush, was identified through the upstream contact information that Pruitt had possessed, and that the intelligence package had partially documented. Military and federal operations in coordination with regional authorities dismantled the operational infrastructure over the following 3 weeks. The specifics came to Emily in fragments, through Rush and through Wren's periodic updates. 2 detention operations. One oversees coordination with partner agencies, the seizure of equipment and communications infrastructure. The corridor was clear. She followed the process without exultation and without detachment, just steadily, the way you follow something that matters to you and that is resolving the way it was supposed to resolve. Teller appeared at her door one evening with the information that Pruitt had entered a guilty plea on 2 of the federal counts. She looked at him. "Good," she said. "Thought you'd want to know." "Thank you." He started to leave and stopped. The people she put in those convoys, the prior incidents, 2 soldiers from the equipment convoy 8 months ago are going to carry permanent injuries. His voice was flat, not dramatizing it. She knew what the ambush was going to do. She designed it. "I know," Emily said. "Doesn't feel like enough." "It rarely does," she said. "But it's what accountable looks like. It's what we have." He sat with that for a moment. Then he left. She thought about the soldiers from the prior convoys, people she'd never met, whose names she'd learned from the reopened investigation files, who had been hurt by something that had been designed with patience and care by someone who showed up afterward in a medevac helicopter. She thought about what it meant to be the recipient of that kind of deliberate harm. She didn't have a satisfying thought to end on. Sometimes the injury is real and the accountability is real, and neither one resolves the other. That was just true. Durchschmecken. Wren's proposal moved through channels with a speed that Rush had warned her not to expect, and which happened anyway. She received the formal communication 6 weeks after the canyon, a document from the Pentagon's Force Structure Review Office, countersigned by 2 flag officers she'd never heard of, and one she had, approving the creation of a pilot program designation, Combat Medical Specialist/Precision Fires. 1 position, initial authorization. Fort Calloway, where her father's records had been sitting in an archive for 15 years, designated as the program's administrative home. She read it 4 times in Rush's office while he watched from across the desk. "This is real," she said. It was not a profound thing to say. It was just what came out. "It's real," he said. "Wren pushed it hard. The Canyon data pushed it. The Fort Calloway records pushed it." A pause. "You pushed it. 11 weeks ago you pushed it, when you filed the first qualification request." She thought about this first denial, the second, the third, the conversations that went nowhere, the mornings at 03:27 where she lay in her bunk and ran through the case she'd been making and tried to find a different angle. "Where does Marsh stand?" she asked. "Full recovery as projected. He's been cleared for return to duty pending a final evaluation." Rush paused. "He asked about you, whether you were still at Redstone." She didn't say anything to that. "He's been told what happened on the shelf," Rush said. All of it. She'd known that. She'd known he would be told. She hadn't thought about what it would feel like to know he knew, and she thought about it now. The 60 seconds on that shelf, the compressions, the decision to set down the rifle, the thin, stubborn thread of his pulse coming back under her hands. "He's going to want to thank you," Rush said. "That's not necessary." "He's going to do it anyway." She thought about Marsh, unconscious on that shelf, blood on the side of his helmet, the awful asymmetry of his pupils. She thought about the 43 minutes that contained everything she'd done since the explosion, the sprint across the kill zone, the climb, the shots, the compressions, the shot after the compressions, the longest shot of her life. And she thought about how none of it had been performed for an audience or executed in pursuit of recognition. She had done it because it needed to be done. Because the alternative was 17 people who didn't come home and 1 man who died on a shelf while she held a rifle. The recognition was real, and she would accept it honestly, but it wasn't what any of it had been for. "Tell him I'm glad he's okay," she said. "That's enough." Rush looked at her steadily. "You know, for what it's worth..." He stopped, started again. "I've been doing this for 30 years. I've commanded a lot of soldiers." He paused. "I've commanded some very good ones." She waited. "I should have read your file more carefully," he said. "I want that on the record, between us. Not in a document, just between us. I should have read it more carefully, and I should have asked questions, and I didn't. That's a failure of command, and I own it. He held her gaze. It won't happen again. Not with you, and not with the next person who walks into this unit with a set of capabilities that don't fit the obvious box. This was a different thing than his earlier apologies. Those had been about the personal, about what he'd assumed about her specifically. This was about something larger, about what a pattern looks like and what it costs. That's the thing worth changing, she said. Not just for me, for whoever comes next. He nodded. She picked up the pilot program document and held it. Fort Calloway, she said. Report date is in the document, 30 days. 30 days. She looked around the office, at the topographic maps, at the window that looked out over the motor pool, at the base that had been her world for 11 weeks. The desert beyond it, the ridgelines, the canyon road 40 miles northeast that would look exactly the same the next time a convoy drove through it. She thought about her father, thought about him the way she usually did, practical, specific, not sentimental. She thought about what he would say about the pilot program, about the Fort Calloway archive, about the fact that 15 years of his careful records had become the evidentiary foundation for a new category of military capability. He would have been characteristically unsentimental about all of it. He would have said something dry and functional, like about time, or now do something useful with it. She'd try. On her last morning at Redstone, she woke at 0327 by habit and lay in the dark for a few minutes before getting up. The base sounds were the same: generators, distant vehicles, the kind of institutional hum that never fully stopped. She'd absorbed those sounds for 11 weeks until they were background, barely audible, and now she was listening to them as a thing she was about to no longer have. She did not feel particularly nostalgic. She wasn't built for it, but she felt something. She got dressed and went outside before formation, which was also habit. The desert was doing what it always did before dawn, holding the darkness a little longer than the sky above it, the ridgelines still shadow-colored, the air just starting to shift from night cold toward the slow build of morning heat. She stood in front of her quarters and looked east toward the canyon country, and she thought about the convoy road and the birds that had gone quiet and all the things she'd noticed and not said. She wouldn't do that again. Not the noticing, that wasn't something she could stop even if she tried, but the not saying. The staying in her lane because the lane was the only language people seemed willing to hear. The filing of requests and the waiting and the 11 weeks of managing other people's limitations so they never had to confront them. Done. Not with bitterness. She'd processed the bitterness. It was real. She'd given it its due. But bitterness wasn't a place she wanted to live. It cost too much, and the return was poor. What she was keeping was something sharper and more useful. The clarity of knowing what had happened, why it had happened, and what should happen differently. Danny Oakes found her there at 0615, 20 minutes before formation. He had his kit and his orders and the expression of someone in the middle of a goodbye he'd known was coming, but hadn't quite rehearsed. Fort Calloway, he said. Fort Calloway, she agreed. Are you okay with that? She looked at him. He was 20, or nearly, and he had good instincts and a backbone that was still finding out what it was made of. And in 3 weeks at Redstone, he'd taped a tourniquet under fire and kept his head when keeping his head was the hardest available option. I'm better than okay with it, she said. Good. He shifted his kit. I've been thinking about the medical program you mentioned once, the trauma certification pathway. Yeah? I want to pursue it. The serious version, not just the base level. She looked at him steadily. Then pursue it. File the paperwork. Make the case. Don't let anyone tell you what lane you're in before they've bothered to find out what you can do. He took that in. She could see him storing it. If I end up at a base somewhere near wherever you are, he said, and find me, she said. I'll be wherever the work is. He nodded, seemed satisfied with that. Formation came and went, the last one she stood at with this unit, 3 minutes early, watching the desert lighten in the east the way it always did, fast and then all at once, the light coming over the ridgelines in a wash that turned everything briefly copper before it settled into the flat, hard brightness of a Nevada morning. She drove herself to Fort Calloway. She'd requested the assignment of a personal vehicle for the transit, which Rush had approved without comment, and she drove the 40-odd miles between Redstone and the main highway alone, which was how she'd wanted it. The canyon road wasn't on her route, but she could see the ridgeline that contained it from the highway, the specific shape of it on the eastern horizon, and she looked at it once and looked back at the road. Done. Moving. Fort Calloway was larger than Redstone, a permanent installation rather than a forward operating position, with the institutional weight of a place that had been doing the same things for decades. She arrived in the early afternoon and was processed through the administrative reception with the efficiency of a base that moved a lot of people in and out and had systems for it. The program coordinator was a major named Hollis, 30s, sharp, the particular energy of someone running something new, who was still figuring out what shape it was going to take. "Captain Voss," he said, and shook her hand with the directness of someone who had read her file and had opinions about it. "I've been looking at the Fort Calloway training archive." A pause. "Your father ran a serious program." "He ran it the only way he knew how," she said. "The metrics are exceptional. I've been trying to understand why nobody cross-referenced them to your service file." "Because nobody was looking," she said. "The assumption was that a nurse was a nurse. The rest of the file was context, not content." Hollis looked at her steadily. "That's what we're trying to change." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm here." He showed her the facility. The range, which was newer than Fort Calloway's age suggested, recently upgraded, built for the kind of precision work the pilot program required. The medical simulation center adjacent to it, which was better equipped than anything she'd had at Redstone. The combined training curriculum that Wren's proposal had outlined, and Hollis's team had spent 6 weeks translating into actual program structure. 1 course, 2 tracks running simultaneously, precision fires and advanced trauma medicine, with integrated scenarios that required both simultaneously. Triage a casualty under fire, and then take a long-range shot and then go back to the casualty. Do the thing that the Canyon had required her to do, except do it in a framework where people were supposed to be able to do it, where the capability was the point. She stood in the simulation center and looked at it. "First cohort," Hollis said. "We're proposing 8 candidates. The selection criteria are still being finalized, but the baseline is a high tactical aptitude with either a medical or a marksmanship primary background." He paused. "Candidates who don't fit the standard box." She looked at him. He held her gaze, and she understood that he'd chosen that framing deliberately. "When do we start?" she said. The last time she drove to the range at Fort Calloway, before it became her range, before the first cohort arrived, before it became the thing it was going to become, she went alone in the early morning. She'd gotten there before anyone else. The range was empty at 0545, the desert light low and long across the ground, the target frames 50 meters, and then 100, and then out to 400 in the middle distance. The air smelled like it had always smelled out here. Hot rock and dry dust, and the particular mineral quality of high desert air that she'd been breathing for most of her adult life. She set her kit down. She set the Barrett, her issued equipment now, no longer a weapon she wasn't authorized to touch, on the bench, and went through the checks the way she'd been taught. Chamber, magazine, optic, bipod. Each one in order, each one honest. Not because she'd forgotten how, but because the process mattered, and she wasn't someone who skipped the process because she was confident. She took a breath. She thought about her father, not for the last time, not dramatically, but just because this place and this moment and this particular quality of early morning light were the kind of thing he would have recognized. He had brought her to ranges that looked like this, different canyon country, different state, but the same enormous sky, the same distances. He'd taught her to look, to wait, to breathe and let the shot come instead of chasing it. He'd taught her that capability without judgment was just a tool, and that judgment without capability was just an opinion, and that the most dangerous person in any situation was the one who had both and knew when to use them and when to set them down. She thought about Marcia's pulse under her hands, the thin, stubborn thread of it. She thought about the 60 seconds when she'd set the rifle down, and the seconds after when she'd picked it back up, and the fact that nobody would ever be able to tell her that the right call was to stay with the rifle. Because the right call was never simple, and anyone who told you otherwise had never actually been inside one of those moments where the options were all bad and you just had to choose. She put her eye to the scope. The target at 400 meters came into focus, just a standard silhouette, nothing dramatic. She found the crosshairs, and she held them there, and she breathed the way her father had taught her. Slow. Let everything settle. From here to the target was 400 meters of honest distance. No shortcuts, no adjustments for who she was or what anyone had thought she was. Just the physics. Just the breathing. Just the thing she had always been, whether or not anyone had ever been paying attention. She fired. The round hit dead center. She cycled and fired again. Same. She fired 6 rounds in sequence, adjusting her position between each one, working the edge cases of the range, because the edge cases were where you found out what was actually there. Every round hit. She set the rifle down and sat back from the bench and looked at the targets downrange. The patterns they showed, the evidence of 15 years and 11 weeks and 43 minutes, and a canyon shelf and a thin thread of pulse, and a flight medic who had taped her hand and a phone in an evidence bag, and a pilot program with 8 candidates who didn't fit the standard box. All of it was here. Not behind her exactly. Just here, the way things you've lived become part of the ground you're standing on. She reached into the side pocket of her kit. The challenge coin was worn smooth, 20 years of her father's hands, and then her hands, and then her hands again on every range and in every medical bay, and on every deployment where she'd carried it. It wasn't a lucky charm. It wasn't a memorial. It was just a thing he had carried and she carried now, the way you carry the real things the people you loved left you with, not lightly and not sentimentally, but honestly. She set it on the bench beside the rifle, looked at them both. A medical kit would have completed the picture, but she didn't need the picture to be complete. She knew what it contained. She'd spent a long time waiting for the people around her to stop defining her by the half of herself they'd decided was the whole thing. A nurse. Stay in your lane. That's not your weapon. You're good with IVs and bandages, and the rest is someone else's job. She hadn't been angry about it exactly. She'd been something more specific. She'd been tired of it, the way you get tired of anything that is simply, persistently wrong. And she'd done what she could do within the systems she was inside of. And then the canyon had happened, and the systems had finally gotten information they couldn't ignore. And here she was. It wasn't a fairy tale. Fairy tales were clean and fast, and the resolution felt like a door closing. This was messier. The protocol violation was still in her file. The soldiers from the prior convoy incident still had injuries that weren't going away. Warren Sully was cooperating with investigators, and that felt like something less than satisfying and also like the correct outcome, which was its own kind of uncomfortable. Sandra Pruitt had entered a guilty plea, and that was justice, and it was also not enough, and both of those things were true simultaneously. But Marsh was alive. Briggs had his leg and his stubbornness. 17 people had come home from a canyon that had been designed for them not to come home from. A pilot program existed that had not existed 6 weeks ago. 8 candidates were going to arrive at this facility and learn to do something the military had not formally acknowledged could be done. And she was here, the woman nobody had thought to look at clearly. The nurse who had been assigned a lane and a bandwidth and a set of authorized equipment, and who had spent 11 weeks asking to be seen as something closer to complete, and who had finally been seen, not kindly, not easily, not without cost, but seen. She picked up the challenge coin. It was warm from her pocket, from her hand, the way it always was. She held it for a moment. Then she put it back in her kit, beside the trauma supplies and the medication log, and the certification documents, and all the other things she carried that made her exactly what she was. Not one thing or the other, not healer or warrior, not nurse or marksman, but the whole complicated, specific person who had looked at a canyon shelf and a dying man and a rifle and made the call that needed to be made. She shouldered the kit. She picked up the Barrett. She walked back toward the facility as the morning light came fully over the ridgelines. And it was the same desert it had always been. And she was the same person she had always been. And the distance between those two facts, between who you are and who they're willing to see, was just time. She'd learned to be patient. She had plenty of work to do.